Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world and the time you are listening this video. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the stories. The water park in my town is haunted. Some classmates plan to hang out there this weekend. I come from an old Midwestern town. Decades before I was born, it had been a thriving industrial settlement. Now it's a ghost town, complete with a pair of abandoned factories, empty houses, and a disused water park, one of the largest in the country. Back when the region had a thriving middle class, the water park had thousands of square miles of potential customers to support it. But as the factories and the unions left, the water park went bust. Just like with everything else, everyone knows it's never coming back. I only mention this water park because it's haunted. Well, that's not quite right. The water park isn't haunted. It's the pool at the center of the park that is. The pool, almost a quarter of the total area of the water park, has large pistons meant to generate waves, and metal coils at its bottom that can heat up to regulate water temperature. Though it's anyone's guess whether the pistons or the heating elements could actually still work even if the park's electric bill were ever paid again. Everyone knows the rules of the haunted pool. Enter the water park during the day and you'll be fine, but if you're still there after sunset, no matter what you do, you'll be found floating face down in the pool the next morning. As the town lore goes, a decade or two ago, a town detective, Icarus Quixano Thaddeus, went into the park one night, determined to debunk what he thought was a myth, or beat it if it wasn't. He was clever. He set up cameras around the pool during the day, he brought his service revolver, and he even had a friend watching him with binoculars from the top of a tall building in town, well outside the water park. If you're wondering why I know his full name, it's because I visited his gravestone. The morning after his mission to debunk or beat the haunted pool, Icarus was found face up in the water, revolver in hand. Heavy fog had meant that his friend hadn't been able to see anything, and there was no trace of the cameras come morning. Even though I had never met Icarus, out of a certain respect for his effort, I had made a habit of visiting his grave every few months. After all, he was the last legend our town had left. When I had last visited, I could smell the residue of rotten eggs thrown at the grave. Probably just some stupid kids. Everyone knows that you can't beat the pool, but obviously no one would hate Icarus for trying. That was about 2 months ago. Last Wednesday, as I was walking home from high school with two friends, Tommy and John, the spring air crisp and with a hint of newfound warmth, Tommy suddenly spoke. "Some guys are going to the water park this weekend." If the words came as a surprise to me, they shouldn't have. During the day, it was a somewhat popular spot for high school seniors to hang out. After all, even though the water slides were dry, the pool at the bottom wasn't. "That's not smart," John said. "We'll obviously leave before sundown. You two should join us." "I don't know. Think about it, yeah?" "Fine." They both turned to look at me. "Saturday or Sunday?" I asked. "Saturday." "I can't. I'm visiting my aunt's family Saturday. I won't get back until evening." "Come on." "Can't. Parents are making me." We neared the town general store that we passed on our walk home every day. "Guys, my mom wanted me to get bread on my way home. I'll see you two tomorrow." "See you." The owner of the general store had some interest in town history and collected some various town artifacts. A copy of the town charter from about 2 centuries ago, a gear from a now abandoned factory, that sort of thing. The various objects were pinned to one wall of the general store, a sort of tiny museum. There was a short line to check out, and I glanced over the objects as I waited. I almost didn't notice the change. When I got to the register, I asked the cashier about it. "What happened to Icarus's revolver? Didn't it used to be up on that wall?" The cashier shrugged. "New owner took over the store the other day. Probably pitched it." "Huh," I said. Maybe I was just too surprised to muster up a proper response. Maybe I didn't care enough. "No loss there," the other cashier said. "Guy was kind of an idiot. Everyone knows you're dead if you go to the pool at night." "Kind of pretentious too," the first cashier said. "Thinking he could outsmart the pool. That'll be $5.49. I paid and took the bread. absent-mindedly thanking the cashier. I had taken about 24 steps for home when I turned around, walking toward the back of the store, looking around. I last went to the general store this weekend, and I was pretty sure I had seen Icarus's revolver there then. Trash pickup in the town was on Thursdays, so maybe. I found a dumpster behind the store and opened it to a wave of the smell of, well, trash. I had only looked for a minute when I was starting to question whether this was really a good idea, but then I found it. An old, silver-colored 6-shot revolver. Spinning the cylinder, 2 chambers were empty, but 4 still had bullets in them. Before anyone walked out of the store, saw me holding a gun, assumed the worst, and called the cops. I slipped the revolver into my backpack and set out for home. But just when you thought that nightmare was over, let me tell you about something even darker. The Forbidden Tour Part 1. For as long as I can remember, I've enjoyed everything extreme. Skateboarding, BMX trails, even bungeed a few times in my teens. As I grew older, I started thinking about the things I hadn't had chance to try yet that I'd missed. So I started on my bucket list. Everybody has a bucket list, filled with fantastic dishes yet to try, exciting experiences to sample, and places to visit. But the run-of-the-mill, the ordinary choices just didn't excite me. I had to go that step further. Always have, always will. The danger element is what excites me. If there is an element of danger, then I'm hooked. Sometimes I'll be in a situation where my ethics are questioned, but that's what life's about, right? Pushing the envelope, right? I've paraglided over the lost Amazonian tribes, narrowly avoiding fear-thrown spears, sailed the Bermuda Triangle in a catamaran, climbed the world's most dangerous peaks, and traversed the harshest terrains. But it's my itch for the darker side of life that still goes unscratched. Ever since I was a teen, I've been fascinated with anything that gets the heart pumping. This usually came in the form of watching extreme suicide videos and murders on sites I'd rather not mention here. So as I grew older and I ticked off my usual bucket list entries, I drew up a much darker list to tick off too. I want to run with the flaming bulls of Ceuta, Spain, where the people not only run in the streets to escape the stampede, but set the bulls alight first. I want to visit the Aokigahara Woods, also known as the Suicide Forest at the base of Mount Fuji, Japan, to see if I can survive that feeling of emptiness and suicidal bottomless void so many poor souls reported to feel before ending their lives. Of course, my list wouldn't be complete without the door to hell. In Turkmenistan, a natural hellhole that seems to burn forever. Did you know hundreds of thousands of spiders gravitate to that site? Like a goddamn arachnid pilgrimage. I'd struggle to decide which one of these places I would want to visit first, in all honesty. They all hold such dark interest and rich history that they all stand out as must-see places to me before I die. But above everywhere else, there is one place on this earth I needed to visit before I perished. And that had to be Chernobyl. The tragedy that happened there back in April 1986 will forever be known as a global catastrophe, with horrendous side effects that are still echoing out from ground zero today. I don't want to just see the ghost-like streets, abandoned stores, and empty playgrounds from the safety of my own home. So I began to look for tours, trips, or excursions, anything that could get me further into the real Chernobyl. After going through the usual travel sites and the lesser-known cheap sites that offer questionable excursions, I stumbled across a site that looked like it had been made in the late 90s and left in the land that time forgot. The layout was a mess. Most of the text made no sense, and nearly all of the links were long since dead. I almost missed the link at the very edge of the page for life-changing trips, and expected it to be another dead link. But after several quick clicks, a list of dark and borderline illegal trips came to life. I began to work my way down the list, with nothing really jumping out at me of any interest. I'm not into hunting lions. I don't want a deep-sea dive, recent cruise ship sinkings, and I've already spent a weekend in a real mental institute as a guest, not a patient. Midway down the page, when my interest for searching began to fade, a half-blurred advert for Chernobyl caught my eye. Book with confidence. Chernobyl, ghost city of Pripyat. The Soviet secrets revealed. Not for the faint of heart. Click below for further information, but be warned. Upon clicking below, you forfeit all human rights in order to experience a one-off chance in a lifetime like no other. This is the real Chernobyl. I needed to know more. I clicked the blurred image. A tour like no other. We will take you to the Forbidden Zone, not available in any tour. You will see who stayed and, most importantly, what survived. A tour you will never forget. Be warned, not for the faint-hearted or prone to anxiety. We will supply food, drink, and a standard dosimeter. We recommend you bring your own dosimeter, as ours have been used multiple times and cannot guarantee their accuracy, especially the further into Chernobyl you get. We meet at 7 a.m. sharp. If you are not at the pickup point, you will be left behind and no refund will be given. This goes for arrival to the exclusion zone and departure back to safety. We will take your agreement to read these terms as acceptance. All trip balances to be paid 2 weeks prior to day 1 of the excursion. Full itinerary on arrival. Disclaimer: there has been reports of locals being hostile to tourists. Approach at your own risk. No rules tour. That last line I read 2 or 3 times before clicking accept, but I gathered it was just ghoulish humor to match the dark style of the website. And with that, I'd booked. The trip was set for late October. I figured best to book a winter excursion, as all the sites recommended the snow acts as a mild shield for the radiation, and visibility is still good enough with the chance to see wild animal tracks in the snow. As soon as I booked the tickets, I could feel in my bones this was going to be something else. The wait was excruciating, and going alone meant I had noon at my level of enthusiasm. I prefer to travel alone, but to have someone there beforehand would have been nice, I guess. Eventually, October came around. I collected up my essentials in my backpack and headed for the airport. I flew from Gatwick Airport straight to Kyiv, landing at Ukraine International Airport. The tour guide had arranged for us to meet at a little rest stop location on the border of Kyiv. I guess to minimize attention to the tours they ran. Arriving at the location, I grabbed a bite to eat from the rundown-looking cafe and sat at the riverside waiting for someone who looked like they were here for the same reasons as myself. I looked out at the semi-frozen riverbanks, finishing my sandwich when I was briefly startled by an overly excited woman's voice with a distinct American accent. "Hey, are you here for the tour?" I spun round to see where the question had come from, to be met by a huge smile across a young woman's face. She, like me, had a backpack, but due to her smaller stature, it seemed to engulf her. I could tell she had read the same clothing guidelines like me sent through from the tour company. They expressed best clothing to make our day easier, and I suspect to minimize any complaints directed towards them while on the tour. This is what they urged in the email. Walking boots with no fancy openings. Expect to get your feet wet due to time of year, flooding, and extreme temperatures. Full-length thick trousers, no shorts, open-worn jeans, linen trousers or 3/4 lengths. Warm jumper, no short sleeves or rolled-up sleeves. Rainproof coat. Gloves and warm hat to combat the frost. If at any time you begin to feel unwell, your dosimeter begins to falter or you get separated from the group, make your way back to the tour bus location stated on your maps given to you on arrival. Do not lose your map. Further instructions upon arrival. I threw her a polite wave while heading towards her. "Hi, yeah, I am. Looks as though we are the first ones here, right?" I smiled back. I'd been waiting for almost an hour with no sign of anyone who didn't look. "Local. I think I saw 2 guys head over that way towards the bar about 20 minutes ago." She gestured towards the near, empty high street. Midway down the street, a faded sign, barely noticeable, stood crooked against a doorway. She introduced herself as Emma as we headed towards the bar. The bar was everything you'd expect to find in a low-key, no questions asked, outskirts part of town. The lighting was low, except for a few dim bulbs and natural light coming in through the various holes in the walls that came from God knows where. A few tables were spread out across the bar, each with a weary drunk nursing whatever alcoholic drink they could afford. Our attentions were drawn to the 2 loud young men knocking back drinks and enjoying some joke between themselves and the barman. From the way they were dressed, it was fair to assume these were the guys who were going to be joining us on our tour. The thought of spending the rest of the tour with these people left a sour taste in my mouth. concerned my long-awaited trip was going to be ruined by loud, easily excitable members of the group. Emma approached them first. Her presence was enough to simmer their antics as we introduced ourselves. Our new comrades, Joel and Nikolai, ordered us a quick round of drinks to toast our soon-to-be adventure before we headed back to the pickup point. As the four of us walked back along the empty high street, I couldn't help but notice the strange way the locals looked at us. Not so much in a wary way, or suspicious, but more like pity. You know the way a brother or sister looks at you as you get home, and you instantly know your mom and dad are about to burst in yelling 1,000 questions and accusations, all of which you already know are true. That kind of look. When we got back to the pickup point, our guide was already there waiting. Sitting on the step of his rickety-looking short bus, he smoked a roll-up between weathered fingers, barely looking up to acknowledge as we approached. He looked as though he had raided a military surplus store. With his camo trousers, military boots, and thick fleeced jacket, he introduced himself as Dennis. "Hi," exclaimed Emma, stepping an extra step closer to our guide and the bus. "You're late," ignoring Emma. "Everybody on the bus now," he ordered. A few sniggers escaped Joel at Emma's expense as they boarded the bus. I was last in line, looking back at the locals now converging at the mouth of the high street, staring at our group clambering onto the bus. I gave a small wave, met with no response as I joined the others inside. From Kiev to Chernobyl is a depressing 2.5-hour journey through ghost towns and busy industrial sites. All the way Dennis is barking do's and don'ts at us. Don't stray too far. Don't try to smuggle anything out. Do keep in visual distance of each other at all times. Don't question his orders. And don't die unless it's necessary. That last one I'm hoping was a joke, but I'm not 100% convinced he knows what a joke is. I spent a majority of the journey getting to know Emma a little better, the typical idle conversation you make with a stranger when forced together. She told me about her hometown back in Wisconsin, and to her delight, I described back home in the UK. Meanwhile, Joel and Nikolai continued to discreetly drink at the back of the bus while completely ignoring Dennis and his rules. After what seemed like a full day's travel, the bus came to a stop. Looking through the windshield, we had our first glimpse at Chernobyl, other than the obvious devastation which can be seen in almost any direction. My main focus was the several other tours who were here setting up meeting points at the same time, an air of visible excitement amongst them. I thought this was a tour like no other. Surely it would have less people. Decimeter reading peak, 0.03. Dennis could see the look on my face. Before having the chance to ask him, he answered my question. "This is not where your tour starts. We go further. We show you real Chernobyl," he claimed with an almost patriotic look on his face. The engine roared back into life, and we carried on into the exclusion zone, the other tours giving confused waves as we pass. The bus filled with the sound of everyone's decimeters ticking into life. The first hint of radiation echoed through the bus. A silence fell over the bus as we collectively began to realize the gravity behind the first warning tones sounding from the devices secured to our sides. All of a sudden, this became very real. The bus came to a halt a second time, without turning to look at us. Denise pressed the door release and requested we gather our things and vacate the bus. After pointing out a few coordinates on the map for points of interest, he told us he would be back in 4 or so hours to load up for a live hunt with anyone who had a strong enough stomach to tag along. Mobile phones don't work here, so we had to be on time. I'd already figured the other 3 wouldn't be up for the hunt, so if I were to get some time alone, I'd have to go on the hunt. As a group, we agreed to stay together for now and planned out where we wanted to go first. Outskirts of Zalicia. Dosimeter reading peak, 0.07. The radiation warning pinging from our dosimeters was already at a level high enough to sober up Joel and Nikolai, turning their faces a paler shade of gray with the realization we were actually here in the exclusion zone. If I had a mirror, I could bet I was a similar color. Denise had told us before leaving to stick to the paths. Don't disturb any rubble or dust, and never enter any buildings marked with black and yellow tape. As we made our way down the first few desolate streets, almost every house seemed to be covered in that black and yellow tape. Every curtain was drawn nearly completely shut, allowing the bare minimum of light into the empty properties. Every door was closed, presumably locked. I swear I saw movement in an upstairs window of a rundown apartment block. The curtains swayed ever so slightly, but by the time I'd gotten everyone's attention, it had stopped. I know I saw something. I convinced myself that it was my mind playing tricks on me, heightened imagination from the situation we're in. It was harder to convince myself that that was the case for the bangs, swaying curtains, and distant screams that followed. Every other house we passed, curtains flittered, distant bangs of debris being disturbed as if some distant giant had awoken and began to move from its slumber. The faint echoes of doors opening and closing kept us all on edge, expecting at any moment to see signs of life. When the faint sound of a distant scream bounced around the walls of the empty street we were in, we began to move quicker towards our first checkpoint, the town square. The town square. Decimeter reading peak 0.08. We moved in silence quickly along the empty streets, huddled together watching every corner and nook, only slowing down when we reached the center of the square. The square itself was a wide open space with a dried-up fountain at the center. We headed straight for the fountain to rest up. I'm sure it would have looked beautiful before the nuclear blast. We had visibility from all sides, just in case anything or anyone approached us. At the far side of the square, the tables of an abandoned restaurant were scattered. The tables that remained upright still had plates and cups strewn across them, left behind in the chaos, remnants of a peaceful time. We sat and discussed in hushed voices what we thought we had all seen and heard, no one wanting to speak for too long, risking disrupting our only defense, the silence. We agreed to keep our talking to a minimum, instead opting for signaling each other with hand gestures. As we were all reluctant to use the same street to get back, we debated the best route out of town. A noise across the square startled us, each of us spinning our heads in the direction of the noise. Dosimeter reading peak 1.06. Across the square, the chairs and tables of the abandoned restaurant began to fly viscously in all directions, as if something was charging directly towards us. An unholy guttural scream filled the air. We froze for a moment. Whatever was barreling towards us, we still couldn't see it, which meant we had no idea how to defend ourselves against it. As it came to the last of the tables, almost out in the open and exposed, the screaming stopped. The silence somehow seemed louder. The last of the airborne tables hit the floor, and the only noise filling the void was the clattering of the last few cups and plates coming to a stop, while Emma openly sobbed, clinging to Joel behind Nikolai and me. Out of nowhere, Emma let out a stifled squeal. I turned to see her struggling beneath Joel's grip, who was now standing unnaturally rigid. He towered over her, with both his arms wrapped around Emma, firmly keeping her in place. His eyes were glazed over, looking completely emotionless. No matter how she tried, Emma couldn't escape his grip. All the while, Nikolai yelled at Joel to let her go. As Joel's arms fell to his side and Emma fell to the floor, Nikolai and I rushed to help her up. Leaving Nikolai to comfort Emma, I turned to confront Joel. I began to yell and curse. I could feel the adrenaline rushing through my veins. We needed answers, and we needed them now. His chest heaved forward towards me briefly, as if pushed from behind, yet his feet remained planted in place. A patch began to grow across his chest. At first it looked like a shadow growing from within him, but by the time it had stretched across his chest, it was apparent the patch was in fact blood, and whatever had impaled Joel had entered from his back. He didn't drop to the floor. Instead, he began to rise off his feet right in front of me, as if skewered and lifted by an invisible force. His blood began to pool beneath him as he rose higher and higher above the fountain. For a brief moment, I thought he was going to keep on going, until he was so high we couldn't see him anymore, and he was lost to us forever. I wish that was the case. In a swift motion, whatever force that decided to lift Joel high above the town square decided to let him go. With a sickening crunch, his lifeless corpse lay across the statue atop the fountain. We stood in complete shock and fear, unable to get him down. It took far less time than I anticipated to convince Nikolai to leave his friend's body behind, and for us to move on out of there before whatever attacked us came back. As we left the square, a murder of crows took residence on Joel's corpse, feasting on him through fevered caws and squawks. I don't know what happened back there, and I don't know if we are even remotely safe, let alone heading in the right direction. All I know is my dosimeter reading keeps getting steadily higher, and I'm pretty sure someone is following us. If you think that was chilling, wait until you hear what happens next. I regret ever going camping with my friends. There are unnatural things waiting in the woods. Series 3 weeks ago, my friend Matt asked if I wanted to go camping. Since I had wasted my entire summer working, I agreed. I needed a break from chores and my boring office job. As the weekend got closer, Matt kept adding people to our camping trip. Soon, it went from us to 6 people. The SUV I inherited from my mother could fit all of us, and our bags if we squeezed in, but I felt like dropping out of the trip. I knew if I did so, then they all couldn't go because Matt had a smaller car. I'm the type of person that dislikes crowds and prefers to stay indoors. Eddie was coming along, and I didn't think he was a bad guy. He was just very loud. I dismissed my feelings knowing that some strife in my life would be good for me. Just because I would be slightly annoyed by a few things that weekend wouldn't make the trip unmanageable. I could sacrifice a little comfort for my friends. We packed everyone into the SUV and started. I will admit, by the end of the 2-hour drive, I was very glad to get out of the driver's seat. Eddie refused to listen to the no-smoking rule, and his constant, abrasive jokes made me silently consider driving into oncoming traffic. If it weren't for Sophie distracting him as much as she did, we never would have finished the drive. Me and her were closer in high school. I fell off talking to a lot of people because of my busy schedule and had been worried there would be a distance between us. That wasn't the case. We easily picked up right where we left off as friends that day. I parked the SUV in an empty lot near the start of a hiking trail. I was surprised by the lack of other cars around. I had assumed it would be busier. Matt told us he knew of a great camping spot by the lake, but it was nearly a 2-hour hike. I playfully groaned. We had left after lunchtime, and now we wouldn't get to the site until almost dinner time. It was a 2-hour hike for a normal person. Our group wasn't the most focused or motivated to use our time properly. We all made sure to use the washroom before heading into the woods. Getting all our gear on took at least 10 minutes. I never knew how long a group of people took to drag out a simple task. I kept my mouth shut, knowing there was nothing we could do about it. I stayed silent when Jessie realized she left something in the SUV and asked to go back 5 minutes into walking down the trail. Instead of reaching the campsite at around 4 as planned, we might get there closer to 6. We could be cutting it close to set up while it was still light out. But no one appeared worried. Everyone broke off into groups of 2 as we walked. I listened to Sophie as she caught me up in all the things she'd been doing this summer. Since I only worked, I just nodded, letting her talk, knowing my life was too boring to say much about. An hour into the woods, we came across another person on the trail. He had been the only other sign of life, aside from the sounds of birds in the trees. Our group caught up to him, and the stranger stopped to greet us. He wore a gray baggy sweater, even though it was far too hot for one. It was nearly autumn, but the summer heat hadn't let up. He had a massive camping pack that looked to weigh more than his thin legs should be able to carry. Matt and Eddie were at the front of our group. When the stranger stopped to wave at us, we all stopped for a chat and to take a smoke break for some. "Are you all just hiking or camping?" the man asked with a smile. He sounded slightly southern with a warmness to his voice that instantly made him appear trustworthy. Matt nodded down towards the trail. "Camping, we're setting up near the Big Bear tree." He lied. I hadn't been in the area since I was very young, so I had forgotten about the tree until Matt mentioned it. It was a massive tree in the middle of a clearing that someone decided to carve a simple bear face into the bark years ago. It was a good landmark and near the end of the trail. "That's a good spot, even though people do say it's bad luck. I'm just here gathering. I'll stop by the ranger's cabin on the way out." "Have you all checked in yet?" he asked. A mesh bag holding some mushrooms hung from his pack, along with a batch of plastic whistles. He looked over, prepared for anything, let alone a day trip out into the woods. Do we need to check in? I asked, unaware. The group gave me a look. I considered we might need to pay a fee to camp, and they all wanted to avoid it. The park runs on donations. Even if you can't afford one, you should let the rangers know you're all here just in case. Do you have a GPS? He suggested, the kind smile never fading from his face. Yes. It's not our first camping trip. Matt stated, a little annoyed. This man was the kind of person he had issues getting along with. He looked too clean to be the kind of person to enjoy the outdoors. Like he was only foraging to film content for his TikTok account. I glanced down to see he was wearing flip-flops. Seriously, who hiked in flip-flops? The man adjusted his pack, not appearing to be offended by Matt's tone. Do you all have whistles? He offered. We shook our heads at the same time. Matt pulled out one. Gracefully, the man sent down his pack to take off the whistles to offer them to us. He explained he wanted to buy one, but it was cheaper to buy them in packs, so he handed them out to others he saw in the woods. When he bent down, the baggy collar of his sweater exposed a toned chest for a second. Sophie and Jessie noticed first, and Sophie not so discreetly punched my arm until I followed her gaze to see what got her so excited. To Matt's displeasure, we were all handed whistles. The man knew he was overstaying his welcome and replaced the bag on his back. He winked at the girls, showing he noticed their interest, which caused them to pretend as if they were swooning. I tied the whistle to my belt loop and needed to suffer through the group teasing me that the man hadn't winked at the girls, but in my direction. Jessie pretended to be upset that Matt gave the stranger the wrong campsite, joking she wouldn't mind meeting him in the middle of the woods at night. We finally found our campsite after a long walk, sweating in the heat. All of us got to work, setting up tents and playing around. I had only ever set up a tent twice in my life and needed Sophie to help get all the rods in place. Once it was up, I offered to help collect firewood, but that task had already been covered by Eddie and Ben, who had behaved until then. They did the job halfway until they found branches that looked like swords. That distracted them for a while. Matt disappeared for a while. He came back before dark, holding a bag of items that would mean we were going to have a better dinner than canned beans and hot dogs. Since he went camping more often than all of us, he knew what was edible in the woods. He collected something I had never even heard of until then, called chicken of the woods. It was a fungus that tasted pretty good, sautéed with a few other things he brought along. The sticks Eddie and Ben found weren't really enough to last the night. I helped Matt chop up some larger dry branches with a small axe brought along. I mostly brought wood to him and then took it near the fire instead of doing any of the actual work. Matt appeared to enjoy chopping too much to hand the task over. I thought everything had been going well so far. After dinner, Eddie brought out a joint for himself, and with some pestering from Ben, he grabbed another one to share with the group. I refused when it was passed in my direction and gave Sophie a surprised glance when she took a hit. I've never seen her smoke before. The booze came out next, and the group started to get louder, retelling stories from school. A bottle was passed my way, and I raised a hand to refuse it again. Dude, you're not driving. You can have some, Matt said, trying to force the beer into my hands. I had no choice but to take it, but I passed it over to Sophie. Are you too good for my cheap beer or something? Matt said in a tone that made everyone stop talking and nervously look in our direction. What? No. Man, you know I've never really drank, I said, trying to calm everything down. You can have one, Sophie said, holding out the bottle again, trying to get me to take it. I looked over all their faces, confused about how this suddenly became such a big deal. I've never liked the way any alcohol tasted, but normally would have one drink to get people off my case. I also hated what weed did to me and only smoked it once. Smoking and drinking were simply not my thing. I never thought anyone would ever get offended by something like that. It wasn't as if I was stopping them from enjoying those things. I don't want one. I don't think it's a big deal, I said, my hands raised in defense. My old friend leaned in, the cold bottle pressed against my arm and her blonde hair falling on my shoulder. I think you need to grow up, she whispered. The anger in her voice stunned me for a second. For a moment, only the crackling of the fire was heard. I didn't understand the sudden turn of the mood. I knew it might not be a good idea to continue with the conversation, so I stood up. "I'm heading to bed. It was a long walk for me today," I announced. Matt looked away at Eddie as if they were sharing an inside joke. "What, is being out of the office too much for you?" Ben joked, trying to lighten the mood, but he failed. "Yeah, actually, I'm not outside much anymore, so I'm gonna pack it in," I said, and hated how my voice sounded. "I'll see you guys in the morning," I added in a more relaxed voice. I left them by the fire and sat on top of my sleeping bag. It was too hot inside the tent to cover up. My head swam over what all of that was about. I started to question all my actions that day. Yes, I did get annoyed with the smoke breaks, the loud jokes, and how long the hike took, but I never said anything. Was I giving nasty expressions all day that I wasn't aware of? Or was all of this something else? I considered that none of them wanted me to come along, but had only used me for the ride. Well, aside from Sophie, but now I wasn't too sure. But why? Was it my full-time job? Or my career goals? Matt was working at his father's shop. Ben was unemployed, living with his parents. Eddie was, well, Eddie. He crashed at different places until he got kicked out. Jessie was a waitress, and Sophie said she was doing a lot of social media things and had recently started to get paid for it. None of them worked a 9-to-5 job like myself. But who cared about that kind of thing? Did they all really assume I was looking down on them for their lifestyles? Was I overthinking all of this, or did all my friends actually hate me? It sucked being in the dark with those questions in your head as your friends chatted and had fun outside. I decided then that I just needed to get through the weekend, and then most likely not bother to hang out with these people again if they really did want nothing to do with me. It hurt, but I wouldn't have time to do anything besides work and school when classes started up again. Despite the chattering thoughts and emotions swirling in my chest, I slowly drifted off to sleep, unaware that not just a busy lifestyle would prevent me from seeing my friends again. I woke up in the middle of the night in the darkness, disorientated to so many different sounds coming from outside my tent. I stumbled outside, taking a full minute to get free and into the cool night air. My eyes slowly adjusted to the moonlight so I could see what was causing all the noise. Ben had stumbled out of his tent and collapsed to the ground near the fire pit, crying out in pain. One hand clutched the side of his head as tears streamed down his red face. Without warning, he started throwing up. I got to him just as he finished emptying his stomach, and then curled up in a ball. "What's going on?" Jessie asked as she came outside her tent with a flashlight. "Gross," she whispered mostly to herself when she saw the mess. "Ben?" I had knelt next to him, my hands awkwardly hovering, unsure of what to do. "Don't touch him," Matt snapped when he saw what was going on. I gave him a dirty look and held back a snappy remark. "Is everyone feeling all right?" I asked the small group. "Are you saying I gave us food poisoning?" Matt said and started to close the distance between us. "No." "Well, not on purpose. Listen, if we know if anyone else is sick, we'll know if it's something we all ate or just what Ben ate." I tried to explain. Matt was having none of it. He raised a fist as if he was going to hit me. All of a sudden, a noise cut through the dark, causing us to all freeze. Eddie had started to laugh. He tossed his head back, and the sound that came from him chilled me down to the bones. It didn't sound like him. Hell, it didn't even sound human. Did these guys have anything heavier than the joint after I went into the tent? We all stood stunned, unable to move, listening to the awful sound. "It's too loud," Ben whispered on the ground. Both of his hands went to the side of his head to press down as his body rolled back and forth. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Ben's voice started low and then grew louder than Eddie's laughter. He suddenly shot up and took a red-hot log from the fire pit with his bare hands. I grabbed a hold of him before he hit Eddie with it. He didn't even notice his burned hands as I got him to drop the smoking wood to the ground. I said, "Make him shut up," Ben shouted, and it made Jessie and Sophie take a step back. What happened next was so sudden it made it impossible for the rest of us to react. A shape came charging out of the woods, making ungodly noises. It ran past us and directed into Eddie, finally silencing his laughter. His body was knocked aside and bounced hard against a tree. The girls screamed, and I jumped back, shocked at the sight. In the moonlight, a large buck stood, dark eyes looking us over as if it knew what we were. Matt acted first. He picked up a bottle and tossed it at the deer in a blind panic. That was a bad idea. The next few minutes were a flurry of movements. The deer charged through the campsite, tearing up tents and nearly crashing into us. It was a miracle no one else had been hit by the crazed creature. It fled back into the woods, dragging Matt's tent behind by a rope that had been caught on its leg. Ben slowly sat down, hugging his knees, looking oddly calm. I stood breathing hard, looking over the damage. We needed to get the hell out of there and fast. I reached into my pocket. Relief flooded my systems when my fingers touched my cell phone only to have it be taken away, seeing there wasn't a signal. Does anyone have a working phone? I asked the shocked group. The girls held on to each other, not moving. They were too frightened to think. I turned to Matt, who had slowly been taking steps towards Eddie's body. I wanted to see if he was all right, but at the same time, I wasn't sure if it was wise to move him. Do you have one of those satellite phones? I asked Matt, unaware that would set him off again. Not all of us are made of money like you. He snapped. I was taken aback. What the hell was with all of these people that day? First of all, that has nothing to do with this situation, and second of all, I'm not. I'm barely supporting myself. I shot back. My stomach rolled from the stress. This is why I hate hanging out with you. It always goes back to your dead parents. Matt yelled in fury. I stood, my mouth slightly open, unable to process any of this. I shook my head as if that would help. Eddie could be dead before the morning. We needed help for him soon. Without a working phone, our best bet was to get back to the SUV. I remembered the man we met on the trail and how he mentioned the ranger station. They should have a radio or a way to contact someone in an emergency. I'm going to rush back to the SUV. Matt, you know the woods better than anyone. You should go to the ranger's cabin asking for help. Anyone is welcome to come with me back to the car, I offered. Strangely, Jesse and Sophie shook their heads. At first, I thought they were going to go with Matt, but they offered to stay behind at the campsite with Eddie and Ben. I nervously glanced at Ben, who had sat silently since the deer ran off. There wasn't much we could do for Eddie right now, and if Ben snapped, the girls could get hurt, and it was possible the rabid deer would come back. And yet, they both wanted to stay behind. Neither could drive, so it wasn't as if they could go to the SUV instead of me. I accepted their request and borrowed a flashlight to start heading down the trail. Matt was going to collect himself before starting on his way to the ranger station. I had only taken a few steps down the path when I heard screaming in the dark from the campsite I had just left. Against my better judgment, I ran back into the woods only to get cut off by a deer running in front, blocking my way. More screams came from the forest as I helplessly stared down the animal in my way. There was something wrong with the way it looked at me. I stepped to the right and it took a step to the right. I moved left and it moved left. The movement made a chill run down my spine. The creature raised a head and let out a long, haunting noise, drowning out the other sounds. My body jumped and I started to run to what I thought was back towards the campsite. I raced through the woods with all sorts of noises echoing through the trees. Some sounded like the girls' screams, and other noises were something I didn't think anything natural could make. My heart raced as my flashlight beam bounced across the forest floor. I was blinded by fear and didn't see the sudden drop-off of a steep hill. I stopped too late and ended up slipping down the slope, rolling, and losing my grip on the flashlight. My body slammed against hard rocks and exposed tree roots. Exposed skin was torn and bruised from the fall. I ended up at the bottom, dazed and in too much pain to move. It still felt like I was rolling for a long time. I knew I needed to move, and yet I couldn't. Through ringing ears, I heard a voice coming from above. "Are you all right?" Unable to speak, I raised a hand with a thumbs up. The moonlight was bright enough to see the outline of the stranger we met on the trail earlier. He was missing his pack and had changed into a darker sweater. "Hang on, I'll get you." I wasn't able to protest before he started down the hill that had taken me out. He glided down as if it was a mastered hobby of his. He stopped above me, leaning over to get a better look at my injuries. "Did you hit your head? Do you think it's okay to move you?" he asked. "Yeah, I'll be fine. We need to get back to my friends. They're in trouble. Weird stuff is happening." I told him and slowly started to sit up as I spoke. I felt a hand wrap around my wrist, and with ease, he helped me back to my feet. To my embarrassment, he bent down on one knee, offering to carry me on his back. "I'm not a koala," I replied to his silent offer. "This way to faster." I hated that he was right. I accepted the suggestion, and with his longer legs, we were up the slope within the minute. My entire body hurt, and I was silently thankful I didn't have to struggle up the hill. "So, Mr. Koala, what's your name?" "I'm Arlen." My face turned sour. "Michael," I muttered and started to head back towards where I thought the campsite was. He stopped me and tapped his nose as if that meant something. "I smell your fire pit in this direction," he said and pointed the other way. We hadn't seen any other campers, so the only fire in the woods should have been made by us. I very faintly smelled smoke, but that could have been because of his suggestion. I followed him, going as fast as my body would let me. "What are you still doing in the woods?" I asked him. With everything that happened so far, I didn't trust a stranger out in the woods. If the deer weren't acting the way they had, I would have assumed all my friends were on a bad trip. Something was going on, and he might have been connected to it. I was ambushed by a feral squirrel. I needed to ditch my pack to outrun it. I was hiding from it until I heard screaming. Arlen explained and looked over his shoulder. "No matter what happened to you tonight, at least it wasn't something that embarrassing." I coughed to hide a laugh. Wrinkles appear at the corners of his eyes when he smiled. Some of the tension of the night broke for a few minutes. I needed some humor to collect my thoughts as we made our way back to the campsite. Any kind of calm disappeared from my chest when we arrived. Trails of fresh blood were scattered throughout the clearing. The fire pit had been trampled and embers were flung around the site. Arlen walked over to stomp out a few spots that threatened to spread to create a larger fire. Something shone in the moonlight. I bent down and picked up Eddie's lighter, which had been abandoned. Was I in the wrong? I asked myself, unaware I spoke out loud. "What do you mean?" Arlen responded in a patient voice. It was odd having someone ready to calmly hear me out after everything that happened. I wasn't certain if I could fully trust him yet. Either he had nothing to do with all of the strange events, or he wouldn't believe the rabid deer story. A friend of mine got hurt pretty badly. I left to head back to the car because none of our phones had service. Should I have forced someone to come with me? I mean, what happened after I left? What is even going on? I shoved the lighter in my pocket and started to bite my thumbnail. It was a habit I thought I had outgrown. You couldn't force them to come with you if they refused. I wish I had more answers for you. I do find it odd you all didn't have service. Has it been spotty all day? He asked. I realized our phones had no issues before dinner time after he asked the question. I suddenly felt guilty for standing around talking with fresh blood on the ground and no signs of my friends. My phone had stayed in my pocket even after falling down the slope. I wanted to double check to see if there was still no service. My heart raced when I saw a single bar on the newly cracked screen. Sadly, the bar was gone the moment I tried placing a call. I held my phone out as far as I could reach, as if that would help get the signal back. I was distracted by the night sky for a second. Faint streaks of light crossed the sky. I didn't think there was a meteor shower that night, and yet a handful shot across the darkness. Arlen reached over and took my phone. I protested a little, but he held it up out of my reach. "I'm taller," he pointed out. The extra height did nothing to help get my connection back. We gave up, and I tucked the phone away. I asked Matt to head to the ranger's cabin. I wonder if he left and then something happened to everyone else. Even if he didn't reach the cabin, maybe it would be better to go there to get help than try to find everyone. But I don't know where it is, I said, frustrated over the events of that night. "I'll take you there," Arlen said and turned to start walking away. "Really?" I said, a bit shocked. Since I met him, his expression has never changed. He was still the friendly person we met on the trail. He wasn't fazed by the sight of blood or finding me at the bottom of a hill. And now he was offering his time to a stranger instead of just leaving the woods. "Yes, why not?" he said, amused by my reaction. "You don't even know us. The words just slipped out. I try to help others when I can, but I rarely ask for anything if it's beyond an easy task. Someone going out of their way for me was such a foreign concept at that moment in my life. I don't know your friends, but I know you. You're a koala in disguise, he joked. This was not the moment for humor, and yet I accepted it. It wasn't as if I could handle any of this on my own. I needed to trust him, at least for now. Before we left the campsite behind, we glanced around for a flashlight. We weren't able to find one, but I picked up the axe Matt had used for firewood. It felt far too heavy, and yet I didn't want to leave it behind. I silently followed behind Arlen, praying our hike to the ranger's cabin would be easy. Things are never easy. We walked for a while. In the dark, it was hard to tell time. I hurt from the fall and my chest was tight with stress. I gripped the axe handle so hard the rough wood rubbed into my palms. The events of the night ran through my head. No matter what, I couldn't think of any answer to what we saw. If there was something in the forest that made the deer and squirrels go feral, then why did Ben and Eddie get sick? We all ate the same food. Those two drank from different water bottles. If it was a tainted stash, then that didn't explain the deer. Suddenly, Arlen stopped, his body tense. His dark eyes stared off into the woods as if he saw something I didn't. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but I was scared the noise might bring trouble. Then a whistle cut through the darkness. I gripped the axe tighter, and my head felt light. We caught each other's eyes, and he nodded. I grabbed the plastic whistle he gave us and blew on it, answering the call. There was a pause, and the sound was returned along with a distant cry for help. I wasn't sure which of the group it was. I just felt glad we found someone. I started forward towards the whistling sound, stopping only long enough to figure out where it was coming from. Each minute was agony until I saw a figure through the trees. "Ben!" I shouted and lowered the axe. His head turned towards me, his face red and wet with tears. I've never seen Ben cry before. He was always the rock of the group, and now he was stuck to the spot sobbing because he was so glad we found him. "It's so dark here, I got scared. Did you bring Mr. Hoppy?" He sniffled, ribbing his eyes like a child. I had stopped a few steps away from him, confusion seeping into my expression. "Mr. Hoppy?" I asked, getting a very bad feeling over this interaction. "I want to go to bed. It's dark, but I need Mr. Hoppy to sleep," he explained, and large tears threatened to start again. "We're going to the ranger's cabin. Maybe Mr. Hoppy is there," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "No, it's too dark and scary out there. I don't want to be alone. If Mr. Hoppy isn't here, you'll have to help me sleep instead." His hand reached out and took hold of my wrist before I could react. His grip was so tight I thought he would crush my bones. Still, I couldn't bring myself to raise the axe in my other hand to attack my friend. "Hurry up and join us, so we're not alone." To my horror, Ben reached up and took a hawked finger inside his mouth. He started to pull until the flesh tore and ripped away. He didn't have any reaction of pain as he opened his mouth so wide it looked like his lower jaw unhinged itself. His flesh pulsed unnaturally. Some blood came from the rip, but the wounds healed over, giving him a forever wide mouth, gruesome appearance. I started trying to pull away, finding it impossible. His expressionless eyes stared into my own as panic overtook my body. Another ripple ran through his face, and all of a sudden, the flesh on the left side exploded outwards in gore and twisted shapes. It was as if a bloody kind of vegetation was trying to get through his skin and fusing with his flesh and bone. I felt the axe hand get ripped from my hand. Then someone grabbed the back of my shirt with a powerful hand and pulled me backward as Ben kept a hold of my wrist, extending his arm. With a single swift cut, Arlen chopped off Ben's arm at the elbow. I felt myself get lifted off the ground for a second. Then we were running. Ben didn't follow, but let out a scream similar to the sound the deer made before. We ran until my legs gave out and my lungs burned. I finally stopped, sweat stinging my eyes and my face burning. I felt something on my arm, and disgust rose through my throat when I realized Ben's hand had not let go. Silently, Arlen helped me pry the fingers off my bruised wrist, and then he tossed the arm deep into the woods. I collapsed against a tree. My face was in my hands, and my body shaking. Not only was I mortified over Ben's face transforming the way it had, I was ashamed over my reaction. I had a weapon in my hand. If Arlen hadn't been there, I might have died because of shock. A noise stirred me from my misery. Arlen had started to whistle a song, his back straight and staring off into the woods. He noticed I was staring at him and he stopped. I whistle when I get nervous, he admitted, and for the first time I saw a hint of stress on his face. I could understand that. But did he really have to pick "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life"? Not the best song for the moment, I commented, trying to stay collected. I think it's the best song for moments like this. Sure, we saw something terrifying, but we got away, right? He pointed out, his smile appearing forced. I was going to agree with him, but something far worse than Ben found us. Due to all the noise we made from running, it could have been following us for a while without us noticing. "Hey guys, spare some snackies?" The voice belonged to Eddie, but it was all wrong. The words were choppy and unnatural. I stood up, legs shaking far too much to make a run for it. I wished the moon wasn't so bright that night. I wanted to never see what walked through the trees towards us. A deer hobbled along carrying extra weight. Coming out from the base of its neck was the chest of a longtime friend. He hung upside down, arms swaying and fingertips nearly touching the ground. More of the almost flower-like growths circled where they had been fused. The monster stopped walking and stared at us with 2 sets of eyes. "Alone." This time the word came from the mouth of the deer, using Eddie's voice. Something cracked as the deer's head started to turn. Slowly, Eddie's upper half rotated around, making him and the deer head trade places. He reached out his arms as if offering an embrace. "You snack eyes or friend eyes?" he asked, head jittering with each syllable. The monstrosity charged forward, wanting our flesh. I pressed my body hard against the tree, cursing my body and refusing to react the way I wanted it to. Arlen planted his feet hard on the ground and braced himself. He used the momentum of the creature against it. The Eddie creature realized its mistake the moment the axe blade was planted in the middle of his face. It dug down deep as Arlen pressed his entire body against the handle. His feet were pushed back, digging up dirt. He lost both of the flip-flops he had been wearing, and yet didn't react to the twigs and rocks cutting into his soles. They both stopped, Arlen keeping the monster's body still standing. He backed off, letting go of the handle and letting them both fall. He then leaned down with his hands on his knees, breathing heavily. The monster twitched, and the deer's head started to move upwards, as if trying to replace Eddie's. Arlen moved fast. He planted a foot against the creature and ripped the axe free. He brought the weapon down again and again. Splashes of blood flew from the attack, covering the front of his sweater and even spattering across my clothing. He kept hacking until the handle broke off in his hands. His last attack was to drive the wood down deep into the mess of the deer skull. Silence came over the forest aside from his ragged breathing. He looked over what he had done and lifted his sweater to clean away most of the blood off his face. His eyes landed on me, and then he looked back at the mess at his feet. "Excuse my French, but fuck." He paused to gesture towards the pile of gore at his feet. "All of whatever this is," he finished. "That used to be my friend." I finally answered. The word hung heavy in the air. His expression changed to pity when he looked back down at the mass of flesh and bone. The body twitched, and I worried that it would get back up again. We needed to move before that happened. "We're not that far from the ranger's cabin. Come on." With some gentle prodding, Arlen got me moving again. I hated all of this. I hated how I froze up and how every sound off in the woods made me jump. And I hated not having answers. Arlen stopped for a few seconds, checking the trees and ground as if he was tracking something. He also glanced up at the sky. I wondered if he knew how to get around based on the location of the stars. He noticed being watched and pointed towards a pair of fallen trees. "I've memorized a lot of key locations of the woods, so I know how to get back if I get lost while foraging," he explained. "Are you from around here?" I asked him. This forest was huge. Surely he would need to come here countless times to remember so much of it. "No, just a good memory." He shrugged. He was flexing his hands at his side as if they were in pain. Taking down that monster must have taken a toll on him. And he was walking around without shoes. I wanted to offer him mine, but there would be no way they would fit. "What kind of people are your friends?" I mean, what are they like? Arlen asked as he kept his head directed forward. I knew he just wanted me to talk to keep me distracted from the horrors we witnessed, but I went along with it anyway. Ben was our rock. No matter what he was, the calm one of the group. If you had a problem, he would be there to listen. But around Eddie, he acts pretty goofy. It's the only time I see him let loose a little. I told him, fully regretting ever agreeing to take everyone camping this weekend. What about the other guy we met? That was one way to put it. My stomach churned thinking about Eddie as the image of his body fused to the deer came to mind. Eddie was never that bright, kind of annoying if you ask me. I tended to avoid him if I could, but he wasn't a bad guy. Far from it. Super kind, always sharing what he had. He was also good with animals. He found an abandoned and abused donkey when we just started high school. The year he took care of it was probably the best year of that donkey's life. I stopped walking. My body suddenly felt heavy. I didn't want to move. I just wanted to bury myself deep into a hole and never move from one spot again. I felt tears threatening to overtake me as I found myself chewing so hard on my thumb, the tip started to bleed. I'm sorry. I started my voice uneven. Arlen simply gave me a thumbs up, knowing I needed a few seconds to collect myself. I didn't understand him. He acted so calm and helpful to a stranger. How could he not be a mess after taking an axe to a monster that tried to do God knows what to us? He didn't rush me. It took a minute, but I pushed aside my misery to keep moving forward. Seeing the light of the cabin took a massive weight off my shoulders. I rushed forward, wanting nothing more than to get a hold of a person that could help us. Again, a hand grabbed the back of my shirt, and I was dragged aside. I had gotten in front of Arlen, and an odd, serious expression came over his face. He nodded silently, telling me to stand behind him. I listened and mentally got ready as dread filled my chest. If this place wasn't safe, I didn't know if I could handle it. Arlen's hand slowly went for the door. Then all at once he pulled it open while standing off to one side. A person on the other end swung down an axe hard into the ground and then stumbled forward. In a flash, Arlen disarmed him and pinned the stranger to the ground with a knee to his back. "Let me up, you psycho!" The person shouted, his face red with fear and pain. He was deemed to be not a threat, and I helped him off the ground. Arlen picked up the new metal axe and went inside the cabin to look things over. I followed behind him, and the stranger cautiously did as well. I almost got sick at the sight that greeted us. The small cabin had been covered with blood. The headless bodies of the rangers had been left behind by whatever attacked them. I forced my eyes away. My hand covered my mouth in case I got sick. The smell of blood was overpowering. Arlen walked over the bodies and straight to a bulky radio on the other side of the room. "It's broken." The stranger told us. The words made my heart sink more. At least finding another normal person was a good sign, and I was certain a trail led from this cabin to the parking lot. We would be on the right path instead of stumbling around in the woods all night. I had my back turned from the center of the room. I didn't see one of the headless bodies get back up, but I heard it. I spun on my heel. Blood racing, terrified to see another one of those monsters. The body stood on unsteady feet, appearing like a puppet on a set of strings. Arlen had set down the axe to look over the radio. Everything felt to be in slow motion. A burst of the flower-like fleshy growth came from the chest of the creature. It opened up, revealing a pulsing blue light, encircled with countless half-formed hands. By the time Arlen grabbed the axe and took a few steps in our direction, a set of tendrils shot out, aiming for the man beside me. I picked up a wooden chair that had been placed near the door to use as a shield. The flesh of the tendrils hit hard, forcing me back and splitting the back of the chair. It fell from my hands, but I held on to one large pointed piece. Without thinking, I charged, aiming the end of the wood into the blue light. Countless splinters dug into my hands, and I forced all my strength into plunging my makeshift weapon downwards. The thing convulsed, the back arcing. The light went out, and the growth shriveled up. The body fell back to the ground, taking the piece of wood with it. I stood, breathing hard, looking over what I just did. I guess monsters are easier to deal with when they don't look or sound like your friends. The newcomer stood shell-shocked. Arlen walked over and rolled the other body on its back. The chest started to move, ready to open up like the other one. He brought down the axe a few times, ensuring the creature stayed down. Then our attention was drawn to the stranger in the cabin, expecting answers. "What are these things?" I demanded. He crossed his arms and turned his face away. "What makes you think I know?" He shot back, huffing. I reached over and took hold of a swipe card attached to his belt loop. He was wearing a short white lab jacket and didn't appear to be a hiker. He snatched away his card, knowing his cover was blown. "I can't get you a lot of details." He started appearing nervous. Arlen lifted the axe a little, and the man raised his hands in defense. "I'll tell you what I know. Who are you two? Hikers? Ex-military or something?" He suggested, "A citizen and a koala." Arlen answered, and I wished he dropped that joke. I looked over to him, trying to spot a lie. I did expect him to be at least involved in all of this, or have some sort of military training. He took down the deer creature on his own and found his way through the woods in the dark without any shoes. Was Arlen really just some random person who got caught up in all of this like the rest of us? The shadows don't rest, and neither do the stories. Brace yourself for what comes next. Camping nightmare. The wind howled through the trees, tugging at the tent flaps as I lay awake on my sleeping bag. My dad's soft snores came from the corner of the tent, a steady rhythm that should have lulled me to sleep. But something felt wrong. I couldn't shake this creeping feeling, like eyes were watching from the shadows just beyond the campfire's dying light. The trip had started out great. Dad and I hiked for hours through the thick forest, Kodak bounding ahead, his tail wagging like crazy. I was so excited. It was our first camping trip since I turned 13, and I felt like I was finally old enough to be trusted on my own out here. The air smelled like pine and earth, and for a while everything felt peaceful. But now, lying here in the dark, something was different. I couldn't hear the forest anymore. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence, thick and heavy. I propped myself up on my elbows and glanced toward Kodak. His ears were perked, his body tense. He stared at the entrance of the tent, his lips curling back into a snarl. I froze. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Dad, wake up!" He groaned but didn't stir. Kodak growled low in his throat, and that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside, crunching on the dry leaves. Not like an animal, either. These were heavy, deliberate. Someone, or something, was out there. I slowly reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and I switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness inside the tent. Kodak stood up now, his growl growing louder. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to move, but I had to see. I crawled toward the tent flap, my hands shaking, and slowly unzipped it just enough to peek out. Nothing. The campfire had completely gone out, and the moon barely lit up the clearing. The trees loomed like dark sentinels around us, and everything was still. Too still. I could feel the sweat dripping down the back of my neck. And then, there it was again. The footsteps, this time moving quickly. They circled around the tent, faster and faster, like whatever it was knew I was watching. I yanked the flashlight toward the sound, my pulse racing, but the light revealed nothing, just more darkness. My breathing hitched when the footsteps stopped abruptly, right at the entrance of the tent. Kodak barked, a sharp, fierce sound that seemed to echo through the trees. "Dad!" I hissed louder this time, shaking him frantically. He finally woke up, groggy and annoyed. "What's going on?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Someone's outside," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Something." He sat up quickly, his expression shifting from sleepy confusion to alert concern. He grabbed the hatchet we brought for firewood and motioned for me to stay behind him. We listened. The wind had picked up again, rustling the trees, but the footsteps were gone. Dad opened the tent flap fully, his hatchet at the ready, and we both stepped out into the cool night air. Kodak was already out, sniffing the ground, still on edge. We scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling lingered, thick and oppressive. Dad let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice was tight. "Let's get the fire going again, okay?" I nodded, though I didn't believe him. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. But I helped him gather more kindling, my eyes constantly scanning the shadows. When we got the fire going again, the flickering flames seemed to push the darkness back, but not completely. I felt like we were being watched, like the forest itself was alive and waiting. We sat by the fire for a long time, neither of us speaking much. Dad tried to reassure me, cracking a few jokes, but I could tell he was just as uneasy. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and he convinced me to get some rest. Reluctantly, I crawled back into the tent, Kodak lying beside me, his body warm against mine. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest, and looked around. The tent was empty. Dad was gone. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled out of the tent, Kodak right behind me. The fire had gone out again, and the darkness seemed even thicker than before. I called out again, my voice cracking with fear, but there was no answer. Then I saw it, movement in the trees. A figure, tall and shadowy, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and malevolent. I shined the flashlight toward it, but the beam seemed to bend around the figure, like the darkness was swallowing it whole. My blood ran cold, and I backed away slowly, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the flashlight. Kodak barked, his hackles raised, and the figure began to move closer, gliding through the trees with unnatural speed. I turned and ran, my legs barely able to keep up with the terror that surged through me. Kodak stayed close, his growls echoing in the night. I didn't stop running until I burst into a clearing, panting and terrified. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. The forest was still again, but that didn't make me feel any safer. And then I heard it, a faint whisper on the wind, like a voice calling my name. But it wasn't my dad's voice. It was something else, something wrong. I never found my dad that night. When the sun finally rose, the search party arrived, but they found no trace of him. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just an empty tent and a dying campfire. To this day, I don't know what was out there in the woods that night, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping again. Just when you think you're safe, another story creeps in. And this one is even more terrifying. The Farm Diaries. I've been struggling with the decision of whether or not to share these stories. My therapist has encouraged me to write them down and try to piece together why I am the way I am. The sleepless nights, the constant panic attacks, the plethora of medications I've been prescribed in order to gain some semblance of normalcy. My therapist keeps hinting that my story is that of a bored teenager's imagination, coupled with depression and anxiety, in order to explain why I was so skittish and afraid of life. I know better than that. My parents were told I needed medication, but they refused. They dismissed it all as mental health mumbo-jumbo, and getting them to let me see a therapist felt like pulling teeth. Instead, they sent me to live with my grandparents on their farm for the summer, insisting it would be good for me to escape the city and immerse myself in the countryside. They claimed the fresh air would help me relax and forget my angsty teenage problems. But they were wrong. At first, I was reluctant to leave home, but part of me was relieved to escape. Dad's alcoholism had settled into a steady routine, no doubt exacerbated by whatever haunted him out in those fields of golden wheat. Growing up there couldn't have been easy on him, and just my few short summers spent on that farm had been enough to leave a mark on my soul. The oppressive weight of the past loomed over me, a shadow that whispered of memories I wasn't ready to confront, memories that would haunt me long after I returned home. 13 years old. First summer. The first summer I went down, I was 13 years old. The farmhouse was located on the corner of nowhere and nothing. There was nothing else for miles around, not even a town or a gas station. It was the kind of place you could easily miss if you blinked. But if you happened to drive past at just the right moment, you might catch a glimpse of the house and wonder what kind of person would live in such a remote part of the countryside. Though, it would be a stroke of luck if you managed to find your way to their house. The winding dirt roads stretched on and on endlessly, the turns having no rhyme or reason to them. Grandma kept a surprisingly clean house, the paint a perfect shade of yellowish white, the shutters a forest green. The roof was tin, more hardy in the hailstorms that plagued the Midwest, and was the same color as the shutters. The house overlooked a beautifully upkept garden, full of all the vegetables we were able to grow out there. The moment you stepped out of the car, you could feel the old bur oak trees watching you stretch out your sore limbs. The ancient cottonwood trees releasing sheets of their snowy seeds blanketed some of the area. The dirt road leading up was a straight shot to the house. The unbelievably flat plains looked like something out of a painting. You could look out for miles on a good day and not see a damn thing other than the sprawling grasslands. Sounds great for the growing mind of a teenager, right? The house was an old schoolhouse, built in the 1800s. You could even see the scorch marks in the old hardwood flooring from the stove used to heat the schoolhouse. It took years and years of renovations and additions for it to be the house that stood today. The pink carpeting in the bedrooms was left over from the 80s. The walls were that sensory nightmare stucco type. The house, much like my family, had character and quirks. My bedroom for the summer even had a sliding glass door that led to the wraparound porch. I would have enjoyed it had it not been for the fact it had no curtains, and I was terrified of the dark. The chores were simple: weed the garden, feed the animals, make lunch for Grandpa, who was out in the fields on his tractor doing who knows what, clean the house up after lunch, stay inside where it was cooler until supper time, make dinner, rinse and repeat. I like to collect eggs from the chickens first thing in the morning and check again before making dinner. When I say that the farm is dark at night, I mean it is dark. There's no light pollution to be seen, and I absolutely adored looking up at the stars before turning in for the night. You could see the Milky Way with such clarity. It was mesmerizing. You could see the wispy clusters of galaxies far away, and imagine what it would be like to be up there amongst the stars. My first night at my grandparents' farm was uneventful, or so I thought at the time. The old farmhouse was settling, which explained the creaking floorboards that occurred at all hours of the night. I also heard scratching sounds, which I attributed to raccoons that had taken refuge in the cool shelter of the house. But then, at around 4 a.m, I was awakened by a loud bang. I laid in bed, trying to figure out what had caused the noise. The darkness beyond the sliding glass door was absolute, swallowing the night with a suffocating blackness. The weak light from my room only seemed to make it worse, casting reflections against the glass that distorted my view. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching me. Its gaze felt cold, like icy fingers trailing over my skin, but no matter how hard I stared into the void, I saw nothing. Just endless, formless dark. My breath hitched as a primal dread crept over me, the kind that told you to run, even if you didn't know from what. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it, lingering just beyond the glass, hidden in the night. Its presence was oppressive, waiting in the shadows, silent, unmoving. Something was there, just out of sight. The next night I was too tired to even try to give a damn about any noises. I'm sure my brain was playing some type of trick on me. I was sleeping in a new environment, and I wasn't used to any of it, so my brain was just trying to fill in the gaps. I had been in a deep, dreamless sleep, completely drained from the day's back-breaking chores, when a sudden crash above my head yanked me into consciousness. It sounded like something heavy had slammed onto the roof directly overhead. My heart raced as I bolted upright in bed, listening, every nerve on edge. Silence followed, unnatural, suffocating silence. I waited, barely breathing, but the noise didn't return. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, and my exhaustion eventually overpowered the fear. I sank back into the sheets, unwillingly slipping back into sleep. Morning came, but with it no relief. The sunlight felt wrong as it streamed into my room. Groggy, I shuffled toward the sliding glass doors, but then stopped cold. 2 handprints, smeared and filthy, were pressed into the glass. They weren't just dirty. They were dark, thick with grime, as if something foul had touched them. Downy chicken feathers clung to the muck, their presence as out of place as the handprints themselves. And then I realized they were upside down, high up on the glass, almost 7 feet off the ground. My skin crawled as the realization hit. Whatever had made those prints had been hanging from the roof, looking down at me while I slept. Watching. Probably just a bird that flew into the window, honey. Nothing to worry about. My grandmother explained away. The chicken coop was my first stop in the morning. I said hello to the chickens like I normally did, thanking them for their service. There was one chicken, Annie Yoakley, that hardly ever left her little roost. She was a cute little golden brown hen, and she was as sweet as pie. When I tried to reach under her and grab her eggs, she pecked at my hand. That had been the first time she had ever done that. "What's the matter, girl? Did I come in too fast?" I had asked. I reached again slower this time, thinking that perhaps I had startled her. She pecked again, wilder this time, fluffing out her feathers in warning. I ended up grabbing her and placing her beside the roost, unearthing the secret she hid. Her eggs had rotted, the stench of sulfur seeping from the roost like poison. The shells, once white and smooth, had turned black and brittle, splitting open as if something had clawed its way out. But that was impossible. I had checked her eggs twice a day. No eggs were supposed to be left. My stomach lurched as I stumbled out of the coop, choking on the rancid air that clung to my throat. Even outside, under the wide-open sky, the smell wouldn't leave me. It buried itself in my senses, a foul presence that lingered long after, like something was still with me, watching. What haunted me most about that farm was the unshakable feeling of being watched. No matter what I was doing or who I was with, instinct stirred deep within me, whispering that I was never truly alone. It didn't matter if I was tending to the chickens or wandering through the garden, that gnawing sensation followed me like a shadow. Sometimes I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure lurking just out of sight, hidden among the trees. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and every creak of the old house felt like a reminder that something was always watching, waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down completely. The next few days went by as fine as they could. Grandma wouldn't acknowledge anything was wrong, but I did get a stern talking to about leaving eggs to rot outside. It was the final night of the first week down on the farm. Tossing and turning, it was unbearably hot inside, and even though my body was worn out from the duties of the day, I couldn't sleep. Slipping out to the kitchen for some water, the hunter finally allowed me to see it. It was standing out on the porch, pressed up against the kitchen window. Its face was a void of moving darkness, almost like a blackout TV static that kept its face twitching and writhing. But it was its eyes that truly terrified me. Stark white, perfect circles that seemed to absorb all light stared at me, unblinking. A cold dread washed over me, wrapping around my heart like a vice. Have you ever felt a primal fear? That gut-wrenching feeling telling you that what you were looking at was not of this world? I have. In that moment, I knew I was seeing something ancient and malevolent, something that defied everything I knew about life. I stood frozen, the water glass slipping from my fingers and shattering on the floor. But I couldn't look away. I felt like prey under the watchful eye of a predator. I couldn't even scream, only managing to step into that broken water glass, slicing open my foot. Then, without warning, it moved. The twitching void that I assumed was its face stretched into a grotesque grin, wide and impossible, revealing a mouth filled with jagged, shadowy teeth that seemed to ripple like liquid smoke. I was rooted in place, my body betraying me as I felt the paralyzing weight of its gaze pressing against my chest, suffocating me. The air felt charged with a palpable tension, every instinct screaming at me to run, to escape, but my legs refused to obey. It was as if I was caught in a web, a fly ensnared by a spider whose hunger was now directed at me. The creature began to whisper, a sound like rustling leaves and groaning earth seeping through the night air. I watched as the blood from my foot started to rise from the ground, forming little droplets. They rushed over to the window, phasing through it like it wasn't even there. The gaping maw of its mouth inhaled my blood. It was tasting me. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but now I do. I'm tired now. Recanting all of this has left me exhausted. I pray I can sleep. Don't get too comfortable. There's something far more sinister lurking just around the corner. My recon team was sent on a mission I still can't explain. When you do any sort of dirty work for any government, it becomes natural that you become numb to most things others would find disturbing. Be it killing enemies of the state, or raiding local cults, or terrorist cells, You naturally start developing thicker skin to cope with the horrible things the government asks you to clean up for it. If not, you are to be replaced and accounted for. Think of yourself as a cog in its machine, nothing but replaceable scrap. What me and my team found was something no one should ever witness, but we need people to know. My name is Jackson Madding, and I am a sergeant on the American Security and Recon Team Dying Star. And I'm currently on a non-traceable laptop in a non-disclosable location. Currently writing out this story as to let as many people I can speak to know the things I encountered with my team. The American government is currently attempting to cover up what we discovered that day, which involved the death of 2 of my teammates. I believe we encountered the most dangerous bioweapon known to humanity, and the American government is trying to cover it up. I still don't fully grasp the picture, but it doesn't matter. People deserve to know. It was a cold day in May when me and my team were contacted by government officials. Apparently, in the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of California, the FBI got anomalous leads to an oil rig about how a company, biotech, was stationed there and developing something potentially harmful to animal life. Soon, my team, codenamed Dying Stars, was sent to deal with it. Although there were hints of the danger being biological, our team was sent in, which I found odd. If there were biological dangers, shouldn't the CDC be dealing with it? As I thought over this, I shifted in my seat, my shoulders rubbing against my teammate's shoulder. Testing radio equipment, I listened to our commander, Alex, speak into his radio in a loud enough voice over the spinning blades of the helicopter for something to pick up. Sure enough, all of our radios crackled to life, catching the lieutenant's check. Seems to be functional. I heard Ramirez chime in as he hoisted his rifle into his lap, his legs hanging outside of the helicopter. I guess I should introduce my teammates, as all of them were with me at the start, and it'll help keep. I'll start with the leader of our unit, Alex. Alex is a gruff, older man with graying hair and sagging eyes. He'd been with this team at the start, being the former second-in-command alongside me and Leonard Jack. When Jax died during one of our missions, he was promoted to lieutenant and given control over our unit. Alex is nearing around his 40s, but he acts like one of those stereotypical 60s guys, complaining about technology and the new generation. Made sense, since he originally fought in the war against terror before eventually becoming Navy SEALs. His above-average skills managed to land him here in this job, where he continues to fight against those who would wish to tear down America. Following him is Ramirez. He was around his mid-20s, had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a chipped tooth that loved to show itself whenever he had that big grin of his. Ramirez, although we'd say was a general asshat and prankster, was most likely our glue. Whenever things felt like they went wrong, we had a bad day, he always attempted to cheer us up. It usually worked, because as much as Alex would deny it, the man had charisma. His reasoning for joining was because his mom died in a terrorist attack, and ever since he's been wanting to get at the people who killed her, along with every other innocent soul taken. His talent is his above-average intelligence, which allowed him to basically crack open anything if given enough time and resources, which proved vital in our missions. Next was Sipel Hoffman. He was a middle-aged man with black hair, green eyes, and a permanent scar across his right cheek, which he said came from when he was attacked by a dog in his youth. I don't know much about the man, other than he's somewhat quiet and standoffish. What I did know was that he liked solitaire and had a boyfriend. When I asked him about it, he showed me a picture of his boyfriend and him relaxing in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. It's one of the few times I've seen the man smile. Ramirez often joked about his sexuality, but they weren't ill-willed and more or less something he poked some fun at, which Hoffman allowed. He was a distant man, but he could understand emotions. Hoffman's skill was his ability to handle most explosives with ease, which he out to good use several times. Why he joined is still something I don't know. Following him was the only female of our group, Sam. She had turned 22 a few days prior to the mission, had black wavy hair and silky smooth mixed skin. She was the most recent member and joined the year prior. She simply joined as to feel she was doing something for the greater good, along with the great pay it provided. I quickly became close friends with her. realizing our similar interests in a variety of subjects, such as sci-fi media. She was simply a good shot and often acted as our sniper. And then there was me. I'm 23 years old, both as I'm writing this and when the mission happened back in March. I grew up in Indiana most of my life and was used to the simple urban lifestyle. My reason for joining was simply for the pay, as otherwise I would have taken another job. I've come to appreciate my job, or at least I did until this mission. My job was to make sure everything mechanical was working in case one of our flashlights broke or if one of the radios were busted. Now back to the mission at hand. We were briefed slightly on the situation, but for the most part, we were just as in the dark as the FBI in what was truly going on at the time, especially because everything was radio silence. Ergo, we were sent it to see what was happening and to eliminate any potential problems. As the 5 of us waited to arrive at the oil rig, the co-pilot suddenly spoke out to us. We're currently experiencing radio silence on the other end, and we aren't sure what is currently happening on the rig. What we do know is there's a threat on board. What kind of threat? Alex blurted out, his rifle sitting upright in his arms as he checked the magazine. We believe it to be biological in nature, hence why you were provided with military gas masks. If that's the case, why isn't the CDC looking into this? I spoke out, wanting the answer to the question as it nagged at me. Unfortunately, the co-pilot shrugged in response. Not sure. Whatever the case is, they're sending you all in to eradicate any threat and to reestablish radio contact. Yeah, they want to make sure they can radio over the lottery numbers. Ramirez chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Alex clearly wasn't amused about the joke and grunted at Ramirez. Corporal, take this seriously. We aren't sure what could be waiting us on that rig. Ramirez gave back an annoyed expression and sighed, looking out at the sea. Hua, Lieutenant. After about 10 more minutes, the rig was now in sight. Seeing one in person is definitely off-putting, as it's a crazy thought that it's possible to even build these in the ocean, let alone to siphon out oil. When we closer to the rig to search for a landing spot, it became clear that there was no activity on the top deck at all. No activity on the deck. However, there appears to be several signs of struggle. Alex muttered through his gas mask, observing the deck. He always had a knack for scanning his surroundings thoroughly. After a few seconds of searching, we found a landing pad in the northeastern corner of the rig. As we land, Ramirez hopped off the helicopter, scanning the landing pad and area around us before turning his head back slightly. Landing area clear. One by one, each of us jumped off the helicopter, making sure our rifles were topper off as we prepared to commence with the operation. As we prepared ourselves, Alex waved off the helicopter. As the helicopter lifted off and began to fly off, our radios crackled to life with the co-pilot's voice. Dying Star, we are on our way back to base to refuel. You are free to commence with the mission as planned. Secure any civilians and neutralize any potential threats. Alex leaned into his radio. Copy that, Black Cat. We'll commence a sweep on the top deck before exploring the rest of the rig. Copy that, Dying Star. Good luck. And with that, the radio crackled and went silence. Now alone, Alex turned off the safety on his rifle. All right, we're going to commence a full sweep of the top deck first, before moving down to the inner parts of the structure. Matt, take Hoffman and Sam and explore the rest of this deck. Ramirez, with me, will be checking the control deck to see if there's any critical damage. With Alex's orders, our two groups begin to search the entire top deck. As Hoffman, Sam, and I walked throughout the deck, we didn't find a single body, nor any clothing, but we saw chairs and tables flipped, crates and equipment destroyed, and multiple pools and streaks of blood, and what appeared to be some type of green fungus or mold in the occasional patches here and there. Damn, what happened here? Sam broke the silence, kneeling down as she inspected that strange fungus. That's our job to find out. Hoffman spoke as he then spoke into his radio. Alex, do you copy? We're seeing signs of struggle, blood, and what appears to be some type of moss or fungus strewn about. Anything on your end? After a few moments of silence, the radio managed to crackle to life. We copy you, Hoffman. We have seen broken equipment and traces of blood. Can you confirm? I then chimed in through my radio. Yeah, we're seeing what you see. Any bodies, though? No signs of any bodies anywhere. We're just reaching the... Suddenly, the radio cut off. We all looked at each other, confused. I assumed the radio simply didn't catch what he said and responded. Alex? Ramirez? You two copy? After a few seconds, the radio crackled to life. If you three can hear me, get up to the control deck right now. We got a dead body, but it's not from any normal wounds. Christ, just get up here. Now that was something none of us were expecting. The body part didn't really worry us. That was one of the things we were expecting. It was Alex's tone that made us anxious. He sounded shocked. Anxious, even. Alex wasn't a soft man. Hell, he barely even showed any weakness. Whatever this was, he was clearly nervous about it, which in turn made us nervous. We finished sweeping the top deck, not finding much before heading up to the control deck. The whole rig shook and turned from the waves crashing below, its rusted legs groaning beneath us. I have to be honest, I thought the thing was going to give way any second. After a small trek up some stairs, we managed to find the control deck. Looking inside, we saw Ramirez standing over the controls and Alex kneeling next to the corpse he mentioned. It didn't take long until we knew why he seemed so anxious. The corpse had that ugly, bright orange construction suit on, which was stained in blood and that strange fungus. But the worst part was half of the left part of his head was coated in that green organism, which was visibly moving down his arm on the jumpsuit. Upon seeing us, Alex looked up, and we could see under his gas mask his face was completely pale. Just what the hell is going on here? If that sent shivers down your spine, the next tale will leave you frozen in fear. My friend liked to play pranks, but I wish he had stopped after he died. Louis had always been the class clown. I had known him since elementary school, and he never failed to make me laugh, albeit at the expense of someone else. Itching powder, thumbtack on the teacher's chair, electric hand buzzers, etc., etc. As we got older, his pranks got nastier. Once a teacher gave him an F on a big test, and in retaliation, he broke into their car and smeared fish guts under the floor mats. They could never completely get the smell out, and eventually got rid of the car. A few months ago, we had our prom and went to a party afterwards. I'm not too experienced with drinking, and was pretty trashed after a few beers and shots. But Louis kept going and going until he suddenly just seemed to disappear from the party. It turns out he had locked himself in one of the upstairs bathrooms and ended up dying from alcohol poisoning that night. Following a wake his family held for him, me and his friends George and Travis got together to hang out and talk about the good times we had all shared. Then Travis pulled a Ouija board out of his backpack. "Come on, want to talk to Louis again, guys?" he asked. I wasn't too big on the idea, but everyone else was really into it, and I eventually relented. We formed a circle around the board and placed our fingertips on the planchette. "Are there any spirits here?" I asked. Then the planchette began to move. GETFUKED. Okay, come on guys, who did that? I was cut off by the planchette violently jerking our hands from letter to letter. LETMEGO. IWSATREST. The lights in the room slowly began to brighten and fade, like someone was playing with a dimmer switch, and I felt the temperature drop until I could see my breath. I was at rest. Travis whimpered. We had all pulled our hands off the planchette, but it was still moving around, sliding from letter to letter, seemingly guided by some otherworldly force. The lights got brighter and brighter until the bulbs overhead exploded, and we were plunged into darkness. I heard Travis scream, and I pulled up the flashlight on my phone to see that the planchette had firmly lodged itself into his throat, and he was now sputtering and gurgling on his back. We called an ambulance for him, and he ended up being okay. But that was just the start of the heinous shit that would follow. The next morning, I woke up and went to the bathroom to pee. Peeping out of one groggy eye, I aimed for the center of the bowl, but some magical force field stopped my urine from hitting the water and splattered all over the seat and floor. The fuck? I thought out loud as I lifted the seat to find that somebody had saran wrapped over the bowl. I lived alone with my mother and knew she couldn't have had anything to do with this. Then it hit me that Louis had pulled this very prank at a sleepover we had had years before. Things continued on like this for a few days. I would wake up and find a rubber spider on my chest, or that someone had replaced the sugar for my coffee with salt. Then one day, I went to put my sneakers on and felt a sharp pain. I yelped and pulled my foot out to find that someone had placed broken glass in the bottom of the shoe. I reached out to Travis and George to see if they had been having similar experiences, and I wasn't ready for what they told me. George told me he had woken up to a loud banging coming from his closet. He grabbed his glasses from the nightstand beside him and quickly shoved them onto his face to investigate. He said he wished he had turned on the light first because he may have noticed the rusty nail that had been driven through the left frame. It had skewered his eye like a shish kebab, and when he tore the glasses off, he ripped the eye right out of the socket. His parents found him in hysterics, his eye hanging from the optical nerve, bouncing off of his cheek like a fleshy game of paddleball. Travis had similar stories, but none were as horrific as poor George, who ended up having his left eye removed and replaced with a glass one. We decided that tomorrow we would get together once more with the Ouija board and try talking to Louis. We met up the next day at Louis's mother's house. We asked her if we could hang out in our friend's old room for a while. She told us we could, but she had some errands to run, so we would be alone for the next couple of hours. I felt the temperature drop once again as we entered Louis's bedroom. It had been left untouched since his death, except for the urn on his dresser along with a framed photograph of him next to it that had been taken just weeks before his passing. We set the Ouija board up once again at the foot of his bed. My heart raced as I placed my fingertips on the planchette. "Louis, are you there?" I called out. Nothing but silence followed. "Louis." Travis and George called out to the empty room. I was about to take my fingers off the board when George's shoelaces began to crawl out of his sneakers like ropey snakes and wrap themselves around his neck. He tried to get his fingers under them, but to no avail. Travis began backing up from the board and bumped into the dresser, knocking the urn off of it and sending it to the floor where it smashed into a million pieces. I looked up at Travis and screamed. Behind him, the photograph of Louis had come alive. It was banging on the glass frame and screaming something at us. George was turning purple on the ground and his eyes were bulging out of his head. His glass eye had popped out and rolled off somewhere into the room. I ran over to the frame and smashed it on the corner of the desk. "Louis, let George go, please." I stared at the photograph of Louis. It was now smiling and laughing. Then it spoke in an unfamiliar deep voice. "Your friend Louis is dead. Don't you want to join him?" I was shocked. I just stood there frozen beside Travis when I heard the tinkering of broken urn pieces moving around on the ground beside us. I looked up just in time to see Louis's ashes and broken bits of urn go sailing upwards like a blast from a fire hose. They hit Travis's face and began filling his mouth, ears, and nose until there was nothing left on the ground. Travis began to shake and sputter before breaking out into full-on convulsions. His belly began extending until it was almost the size of a beach ball. I started to back away from Travis, but his stomach burst open, sending a mass of steaming entrails to paint the contents of the room. Coughing, I pulled a piece of Travis out of my mouth and realized I was still holding the photograph. But Louis was no longer in it. Disoriented, I tripped over George's now lifeless body. I picked myself up off of the ground and ran into the bathroom to try and wash Travis's guts off of myself. I began splashing water on my face, but when I checked the mirror, Louis was behind me. I spun around, but nobody was there. I threw off my blood-soaked hoodie and ran out of the house and down the street. Every car window I glanced into, I could see Louis's grinning face right behind me. I've ran deep into the woods and barricaded myself into a little foxhole. I'm prepared to starve to death before facing whatever entity is pretending to be Louis. A day has passed now since all this happened. My phone battery is almost dead, and I wanted to post this to explain to everyone what happened to my friends while I have the chance. I can see my reflection in my phone's screen, and I can also make out Louis' face right behind mine. If I die, there's nobody left for Louis. Nobody, except for you reading this. I hope you don't have access to a Ouija board. The night is far from over. There's another tale waiting in the darkness. The Church of the Thrum of Godiva series. I've kept this story to myself for more than a decade in fear of any repercussions. but after recently learning of the death of its last surviving member, I've chosen to collect some of my thoughts from journals and what scant information I've sourced over the last 10 plus years, and write about my experience with what I later found out was not simply a religiously oriented social club working with its local community, but rather a deranged and abusive cult. In the interest of maintaining some level of anonymity, I'm doing my best to omit locations and other personally identifiable information. I will name the people that I was in contact with throughout the ordeal as best I can because they're already known to the area with which the cult is associated and its local authority, and there were enough victims that I feel comfortably lost in the maelstrom of ruined people and broken homes left in the wake of the Church of the Thrum of Godiva. If you have questions, I will answer what I can, but only under the pretense that the safety of myself and my friend's family come before everything else. What I and others went through should be experienced by no one, and I am for one thankful the monsters involved are all seemingly gone. When I left high school, mid-2008, at the age of 16, I immediately applied to go to my local college, where I started in media and business studies, with night classes dedicated to creative writing. This is mostly irrelevant to the story, other than it providing the impetus to my seeking out the church by way of my final exam, being a long-form essay on a local establishment and how it uses media to enroll members into its organization. Simply put, I was to pick some local group and write about how they work with their community and what types of media they might use to draw interest. We were to spend the year developing this essay with a view to hand it in at the end for our passing grade. I never submitted mine. Around Christmas time that year, I had been around town prodding at random shops and local businesses to see if anything interesting stood out to me. A lot of places were starting to use, at the time, the burgeoning social media scene. Think late-stage Bebo, but more likely Facebook and Twitter. These all seemed like perfectly acceptable options given their future-forward approach to their media output. But me, being the smart arse I was, thought it'd be cute to find somewhere that still did it the old-fashioned way. And so I'd look at flyers in shop windows, bulletin boards and the like at our local library. Somewhere along the way I found a flyer headed in big bold letters, the Church of the Thrum of Godiva, which, look at it, it sounds ridiculous and utterly incomprehensible. The only thing that really stood out to me was the Godiva part, because I knew Queen had a lyric that mentioned Lady Godiva in Don't Stop Me Now. Beneath the bold heading was some smaller text which read, "Connecting with the heavens by giving to it everything and everyone whom would seek her." Again, to my eye, gibberish, but extremely interesting sounding. The rest of the body of the flyer was your typical church group fare. Little bubbly clouds surrounding different activities they provide and events they'd put on. Church book club, horse riding day, the ladies' choir, private tutoring, feeding homeless, and the winter feet, among other more menial generic activities you'd expect of any church. Finally, at the bottom was a telephone number. Just a landline with the local area code. No website, no emails, no names of members or leaders, and particularly no local address. At the time, I tried Googling what I could, but there was literally nothing. Not even a mention from our local newspapers. To me, it was perfect. I liked the idea of looking at this from the perspective of old media and how relevant it may still be in today's age. It worked for thousands of years before, right? Surely I, as a smarmy 16-year-old media student, could elucidate on this topic and uncover some deep, meaningful reason why groups like churches might stick to the old ways, rather than trying to appeal to the latest trends. I guess when you work only in paper, it's pretty bloody easy to burn the trail it leaves behind. Right away, I decided to call the number. It rang 4 or 5 times, and then as quickly as they picked up, they hung up again. The only thing me hearing was what sounded like a sharp-toned static sound, then the usual 3-note deadline tone. I rang again and almost immediately was answered, but not before the sharp static stunned my ear again. Except this time I could tell it was coming from a person, as the one who had answered seemingly shushed whoever was making the noise. "Good morning, her blessed light be with you. This is Sarah Kate speaking, reception." A soft, friendly voice spoke. I could hear the smile on the other end. It was so upbeat. "Oh, hi. My name's Alice. Is this the Church of Godiva, yes?" I was still coming off being a little startled by the harsh sound before the introduction, but she immediately corrected me. "The Church of the Thrum of Godiva. Yes." "Reception speaking," she informed. "Sorry, yes, that's what I meant. I am calling to see if it would be possible to obtain your address and if I could come by for a friendly visit this afternoon." "Why, yes, of course, dear. May I take your name again, please?" I provided her my contact details, and she gave me the address and some information on where to find it. I actually knew the location. It was an old Catholic church my grandfather used to attend around the time my mum was born, which I think was late 60s, early 70s. I don't recall anymore, but I remember hearing he stopped attending as the church had been seemingly closed or merged with a larger church elsewhere due to a lack of funding and staff. I guessed, then, that these Godiva folk must have leased or purchased it in the interim and repurposed it for their own needs. When I arrived at the church, I was sort of blown away by its beauty. It was completely refurbished, possibly recently, as there wasn't a blemish on it. It had nice but stark warm white walls with brass adornments and accents around the eaves, and on its steeple, where at the top was a flat cutout of a woman sitting on a horse, where you'd normally expect a chicken or something, alongside the N, S, E, and W cardinal headings. Around the church was like a garden moat, made entirely of gorgeous flower arrangements of white lily, periwinkle, and stunning virginal aconite, or colloquially, wolfsbane. There were bushels of strawberry and peaches all simmering in the sun with waning morning dew. I spent a few minutes here before moving, just taking in the air. It honestly smelled incredible, like fresh fruit dipped in hand-turned cream. The entrance to the church was equally magnificent. A very muted red door with wrought iron embellishments of the Lady Godiva atop a well-dressed horse, in stark contrast to her naked form, with only the thin veil of long, wavy hair covering her breast. She sat side-saddle, with one foot crossing the other, and one hand by her belly cupping the other above it, palms up and head down as though she were cradling a small, injured bird and willing it back to health. The horse's bridles acted as the door knocker. I pulled it forward and let it fall twice. Standing there waiting, I couldn't help but turn back to the garden to spy out busily working bumblebees. But just as I turned, the door silently opened, with only the warm air around me rushing in and mixing with the steely indoor cool to draw my attention back. Standing there, leaning around the door, was Sarah Kate, who was a small woman who, despite looking decidedly not middle-aged, was betrayed by the straw-colored blonde hair she once had, giving way to intermittent wisps of gray and white. She introduced herself and asked if I was the young lady who called earlier. "I am." I let her know and gestured inwards, to which she obliged. Inside was quite modern-looking, to my surprise. The reception desk right up front had one of those all-in-one desks you might find in an IKEA catalog, with that wretched, glossy fake wood veneer over top some particle board. And on it stood a laptop connected to a larger monitor, and I presume the telephone I called earlier. As she invited me in, I was almost immediately startled by the rest of the sight. In a row near the opposite wall of reception were 5 girls sitting on velvet stools, shaped a bit like saddles. They were sitting side on like the door knocker, feet crossing the other, hands at their bellies cupped upwards, with their heads tilted down, and long, dark hair draped over satin or silk shifts that only just gave them a modicum of bodily privacy. They were sheer, but not so much that they were basically naked, with an excuse for fabric to cover them. I immediately averted my eyes out of either habit or a sense of feeling like I was invading their privacy, feeling as although they were covered, I was still somehow seeing something I shouldn't have. Sarah Kate noticed immediately. "Oh, how funny! You're a natural," she said through a slight laughter. "What do you mean?" "Well, we ask that members and indeed visitors do not look directly at them while the fools supplicate. It's part of a tradition, you understand?" Still in her soft and friendly phone voice. "Supplication? Like prayer?" I asked. "In a manner of speaking, yes. Supplication can be like a prayer, but..." She stifled herself, possibly realizing she was saying too much too quickly. Well, I think it's best you let the Father Greer explain it when you meet him. These are members of his congregation, pointing at the girls. Oh, okay. Will I meet him today? I vaguely gesture around me. Indeed you will. He should be here shortly. He's just finishing up a private prayer session with a member. Sarah Kate waddled back around to her desk and kind of just left me standing in the middle of this entrance chamber. It gave me a moment to write some notes down and try to take in more of the room. I couldn't help but feel extremely uncomfortable and a little weirded out by the girls just sitting there in complete silence. Out of respect, I tried not to make it obvious I was looking, and at least tried not to look at their faces. They all looked quite similar. All had that sort of dark, almost black hair that turned somewhat red at the roots as it met their pale, milky skin. They honestly looked impeccable, if nothing else. Not a mark on them anywhere, and their shifts were spotlessly clean, almost painful to look at as they reflected light back at me. From that, I noticed that it was literally the case. Now that I had surveyed around, above them were empty shafts leading apparently right up and outside, or at the very least to some extremely bright lights installed into them. The shafts let a cone of light blanket each one of the 5, and the closer I inspected them, the more I could surmise they were all around my age. Anywhere from 16 to 20 at most, completely motionless, breathing softly and sitting there in supplication. I was becoming engrossed in their otherworldly appearance when just out of my field of view to the left, toward the back of the chamber, I saw another red door swing open violently, revealing 2 men. One very obviously being this Father Greer, adorned in various white and red robes, and what shocked me back into present was an older gray-haired man standing behind him a little hunched over and looking like he had been crying. Reaching his arms out toward the Father until he noticed me, and I his eyes. He quickly stepped backwards and down 1 step of stairs behind him. When he passed a shaft of light, I saw that he was almost naked, only wearing 1, a red sort of cloth kerchief around his neck, and 2, not underwear, but a kind of white sheet wrapped around him like a toga nappy. It sounds funny, but it was extremely strange, especially given the look of sheer hurt and then horror on his face when our eyes met. The Father swung the door behind him and let it slam shut. I jumped, but the girls in prayer didn't move an inch. Ah, Alice? Hello. How nice to hear someone is interested in our little congregation. Father Greer let out while brushing his palms down his robe as if to wash himself of the man in the stairwell. Hi, Father. I've just been admiring the garden and this beautiful chamber. I tried to maintain a friendly, jovial tone, but I'm certain he could detect the undercurrent of morbid curiosity under my words. How wonderful. We take much pride in our little cove. I'm sure it's all very breathtaking if you've never seen it before. He seemed awfully forthright with his estimation of the place. Nothing wrong with that, just that it seemed odd. You usually expect priests and churchgoers to portray a sense of modesty, but not him. Sarah Kate was just telling me about the girls and their supplication. I see. He glances over me toward Sarah Kate's area, then back. And what did she tell you? Nothing really, just that it's like prayer in a way. You could say that, yes. Prayer is often one making an overt plea to their maker, a request or wish for someone or something. Supplication is more internal. There's a far greater focus on manifestation. It's meditative and meant for giving oneself over to the light, rather than asking for the light to be brought to oneself. I think I see what you mean. So they are meditating. They're allowing the light to bathe them, it looks like. They wish to engender, not prosperity. They wish to engender in our minds and our environment a knowingness with respect to the light, to cleanse us of our wrongdoings and allow us to better prepare for her, the heavens coming. Sounds quite Christian to me, Catholic even. His subtly building fervency relinquished at that moment. He wasn't mad or upset, but perhaps disappointed. Not quite. We may inhabit an Old Testamonial church, but we're certainly not Catholic. But you are Christian, at least. I guess so, inasmuch as we are all seeking the kingdom of heaven. That seems very cryptic, Father Greer. Is it in the thrum of Godiva's nature to be cryptic? And what is a thrum, if you don't mind me asking? He let loose a satisfied smile. I'd be happy to explain further another day. I can't spend all day with you today, unfortunately. It is rather short notice, you're visiting, and I have many congregants to see to. Are there any burning questions you have right now I can answer? And in the meantime, He turned away from me, looking over my head again towards Sarah Kate's desk. Sarah Kate, see that you find a time in my calendar in the next fortnight for the young lady to come back and speak to me further. He returned his gaze my way. It was only then that I actually noticed that he hadn't been looking at me at all. He was looking down, past me, almost through my chest. Kind of like speaking to a blind person, where their eyes seemingly point in your general direction as they try to accommodate for a seeing person's comfort by feigning eye contact. Except, where that would feel like a kindness from them, from Father Greer it felt alien. Like his line of sight was magnetically inverse to my own. I shook the feeling and asked, I sort of get the girls supplicating in the light. Aha, the girls, he interrupts, but lets me continue. But why the averting of the eyes? Why can't I look at them or they at me? Well, in the briefest and least full way I can explain, it's a tradition born of the myth of the Lady Godiva. In fact, there you go. Some homework for you to do until we can meet for a proper conversation. Part of our adherence to tradition involves the natural aversion of the eyes from the gentler folk of our congregation. It's partly out of respect, partly abstention, and in many ways another form of supplication. She, as in the heavens, will only allow us passage if we respect the wishes of said heaven. In a certain way I found his speech mind-numbing, but only really in the same way I found any kind of proselytizing similarly mind-numbing. It seemed designed to be purposefully vague, yet maximally applicable to any situation or interpretation. He turned his body to face the girls, but fully dipped his head down to avoid any chance of meeting their eyes, and said, Technically, you may look at them as you are one of them. One of them? The aforementioned gentler folk. He nodded. So I can look at them, fine. Can they look at me too? I don't see why not, but it would only be up to them. I couldn't ask. He paused momentarily, then said, or make them do it. Just then, the girl nearest me ever so slightly curled her hand into a ball and twitched her feet. I couldn't tell if it was out of lapsing concentration or frustration. I could see a thinly veiled smile through his pursed lips as he pondered the motion from the girl. Pandora, only if you wish to, you may turn your gaze. I don't wish to interrupt your time in the light or ask that you break your abstention. We stood there in silence for a few seconds, but in the now buzzing tension between his words, my intrigue and this Pandora's break in form made it feel like forever. I had now fully turned my eyes toward her face. I wasn't regarding the implied privacy I was providing before, or the tradition, or really any social norm I might be breaking by staring. I was completely absorbed in the subtle tremor rippling across her features, or the continued squeeze of her balled fist. I had to hear her voice at this point. I was praying she would speak, and then, there we go. The father uttered and turned almost fully away from Pandora and me. She released the squeeze in her hand and breathed slowly again, then slid off the saddle stool onto her feet. The pad of her steps were so hollow, almost at a whisper, but it was so quiet in there that I could still hear it. She stood in front of me. It was only then could I tell how tall she was. She easily stood almost a foot over me. She wasn't scary or lanky. It was just unexpected to see such a delicate, slight person emerge into this tall, almost divine form in the cone of light still bathing her. I mean, this all happened in seconds, but it played like a slow-motion movie in my head. She tipped her head up enough to meet my gaze and opened her eyes, and she smiled. Then she extended her hand out from her spotless shift toward me, letting her slender fingers hang as if I were to bend a knee and kiss them. At this moment, instead of returning the gesture, I firstly looked over my shoulder toward Father Greer. His back still to me, I could see him turn his head toward Sarah Kate's side of the room, though still downward, and raise an eyebrow. Sarah Kate must have been trying to relay what was happening between Pandora and me, because he nodded, as if to imply he understood, then smiled and turned back away from us. Taking this to mean things were cool, I looked down at Pandora's hand and stretched mine outward while turning up to see her eyes. They were huge. Not scary, not cartoon-like. They were just very large eyes with a watery sheen over them and made up of a very fair but mottled gray tone. When our hands clasped together, I was surprised how warm she was, like almost feverishly warm. I smiled back at her, and suddenly she threw her head to my left, over the father, while at the same time the red door at the back crashed open, and the man from before in the white toga pants fell out of it, spilling himself onto the floor. He landed on his forearms and let out a yelp, which caused both Father Greer and Sarah Kate to rush over to help. Very quickly, I felt my heart sink, as Father Greer let out some so far uncharacteristic growls and yelled at the man, "Abstain, Alistair, abstain," and other things while pushing him toward the door. Just then, I felt Pandora's grip on my hand tighten and tighten until it hurt. Then she wrenched my hand, pulling my arm almost by her side. This pulled me into her chin, and as I struggled not to fall into her, she simply bent her head down to my ear and stifled a whimper, a cry almost, and said into my ear, "They make us fucking watch them." I whipped my hand down and away from her and stepped back, looking at her and trying to make sense of it. She looked at me as if I should understand what she meant, but just then the red door slammed shut. Sarah Kate wiping her hands down herself and hurrying back to the desk, while likewise the father turned back toward us and angrily marched over. Always without meeting our eye line, yet I could tell he was more or less looking at Pandora and me in his peripheral to see what was going on. I looked at him trying to hide my dread, then back toward Pandora, who was now sitting again, side saddle, with one foot crossing the other, and one hand by her belly cupping the other above it, palms up and head down as though she were cradling a small, injured bird, bathed in light and breathing slowly. This whole time, none of the other girls had moved even once. I left shortly after this, having arranged an appointment the following week with Sarah Kate. The father didn't seem to suspect anything happened between Pandora and me, but I can't be certain that he or Sarah Kate didn't see anything, averted eyes or not. That's only half of my concern, however. What the fuck did Pandora mean? They make us watch them. Watch them do what and to whom? It's seemingly a big deal to them about who and when one may watch or look at anyone. So what is she and possibly the other girls being made to watch that had her almost hurt me in order to let me know? I needed to know more, but had almost nowhere to begin, so I waited until the following week to return back to Pandora, to the Church of the Throne of Godiva. I need to take a break, but I promise that I will write again about my experience with the church soon, if anyone is interested, as this was only the beginning of the downward spiral. If you have questions, I will try to answer what I can. Otherwise, thank you for reading, and I hope you have a good day. And just when you thought you could breathe easy, here comes a story that will take your breath away. My friend took me to a playhouse in the woods. I shouldn't have gone back. When I was younger, I was a big fan of urban exploration. My best friend at the time was too, and she knew all the best spots and all the rules for safe exploring. Some of the rules were pretty obvious. Wear tennis shoes and tall socks, wear something you can move quickly and freely in, take a flashlight and a bottle of water. Some of the rules were more subtle, learned through years of trial and error. This story is about one of those rules and how I insisted on learning it the hard way. Nikki, my friend, was and still is one of the smartest people I've ever known, which means she was also the best person for me to get into urban exploring with. Not only did she know all the best places, but I trusted her so completely, I would do what she said without argument, most of the time. After our adventures exploring an abandoned Macy's, an old barn, and several spur-of-the-moment road trips, Nikki told me there was somewhere special she wanted to go. She wouldn't tell me anything about it until we got there, which was unusual, but only made me more excited to see whatever it was. I remember the first time I visited that place with her. It was late summer, when the leaves haven't started to turn yet, but you can feel the first cold spark in the air that promises the seasons are right about to change. One of the things I liked about exploring with Nikki was that she always drove us, so I got to sit in the passenger seat and watch the scenery pass us by. That day we drove out into the hills on the outskirts of town, passing neighborhoods, then houses, then fields with the occasional house, Then nothing but trees, fields, and hills. I memorized the route we took, some part of me knowing already that I would want to return to this place. I wish I wasn't so good at memorizing directions. We had stopped for coffee before making our way out of town, and we laughed and sang along loudly to the music on the radio as she drove. After a long time, Nikki pulled the car off to the side of the road, parked in an area that had no discernible markers as far as I could tell, and said with a grin, "We're here." I stepped out of the car and breathed in deeply, savoring the scent of tall grass, old-growth trees, and rotting wood. I looked around at the tall pines and lovely aspens, then smiled at Nikki. I said, "All right, I'm not sure this one qualifies as urban exploration, but it's a nice spot." Nikki smirked and tossed her long, curly brown hair over her shoulder. "I guess it's not urban, no, but you're really going to like this." I followed her as we walked through the woods. There was no path, and I wasn't entirely sure there ever had been. It looked and felt like no one had ever been out here, except for us. I had a brief moment of fear, remembering all those stories about people snapping and sacrificing their friends or classmates to Slender Man, then shook it off. After a few minutes of hiking over dead trees, through tall grass, and past strange detritus, I'm pretty sure I saw an old wagon completely overgrown with weeds at one point. I saw a structure not too far from us, partly obscured by the trees. Nikki pointed to the structure and said, "There it is." Just past a small river, hidden in the line of trees, was a miniature version of an old Victorian house. At one point in time, it had been painted pink and blue. The trim around the windows had probably been white, and my inner child fell in love with it instantly. In a hushed, almost reverent tone, I asked, "What is it?" Nikki gave me her most pleased smile, the expression she reserved for our best discoveries, and whispered back, "It's an old playhouse. I'm guessing some rich guy had it built for his daughters ages and ages ago. It's beautiful, in kind of an unsettling way, right?" I nodded. It was beautiful in an unsettling way. There was something about it that made me feel like I would hear children's voices, or see a little girl dart out from behind it at any moment. The playhouse was at least 2 stories from what I could tell, and made of wood and stone rather than plastic. The paint was chipping off, the roof was caving in, and most of the glass windows were broken. I was entranced and began walking towards it, sure Nikki would know the best way to cross the river to get to it, but she grabbed my arm and pulled me back. All she said was, "No." I laughed. "What do you mean? We came all the way out here and you don't want to go look at it?" She shook her head, an abnormally serious expression on her usually cheerful face. "We can stay on this side of the river and look at it, but we're not going over there." I chuckled again, but I was starting to get frustrated. "We can wade through the river if there's no bridge or anything. I promise I'll stand right next to your car until I'm dry if you don't have any towels." Nikki had learned the hard way to always keep a towel in the trunk of her car. She let go of my arm, but took a step back. "Mara, look around. Do you see beer bottles anywhere? Cigarettes? Soda cans? Candy wrappers?" I looked around at the ground, noting in surprise that I didn't see anything of the kind. "No, I guess whoever owns this land maintains it really well," Nikki said. "Nobody maintains it. It's just that no one wants to be out here for very long. If teenagers won't party here, then we shouldn't explore either. There's a reason no one wants to get close to that thing. We can admire from a distance, but we don't need to cross the river. Just trust me, okay?" I couldn't. I had always trusted her implicitly, and it had always been a good call, but this time I just couldn't understand why she was refusing to let me look closer at this amazing little discovery. We stood there in the field, arguing about it for a few more minutes, until Nikki finally threatened to abandon me there if I took one more step closer to the old playhouse. Of course, I had to take another step towards it, and she immediately turned around and started back towards the car, ready to make good on her promise. I laughed and chased after her, saying, "I was kidding. I'm kidding." She kept walking, not stopping until we made it back to the car, but I could tell she wasn't really angry with me. We brushed ourselves off, checked each other for ticks, another rule she learned the hard way, then got back in the car and went to the mall. When Nikki dropped me off at my house later that day, she looked me in the eyes and said, "I was serious, Mara. If there's no sign of humans around a clearly man-made structure, that's a good sign. You need to be careful." I smiled, but I couldn't meet her eyes as I said, "Yeah, of course. I got you." I could tell she didn't feel good about it, but she went home anyway. I spent the next few weeks thinking about the playhouse non-stop. I had taken a few pictures of it, and I spent all my time looking at them, zooming in and out and studying the structure as if I was going to take a test on it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and on one warm fall Saturday, I got in my car and traced our route back to the old playhouse. It was a lot harder to find alone, and I had to drive back and forth on the road for a while before I found the spot where I thought we had parked the last time. It was mid-afternoon, and the first thing I noticed when I got out of my car was the total lack of sound. There were no birds singing, no small animals rustling in the underbrush, nothing. I couldn't remember if I had heard animals or not when I came here with Nikki, but I pushed on despite my unease. I walked through the brush and tall grass for a while before I finally saw the playhouse in the distance. I had imagined that scene in my head in the days leading up to it, and I had expected to feel elation. Instead, I felt a vague unease as storm clouds gathered in the distance. I told myself it was just my brain fooling me because of the storm clouds and pushed on. When I got to the river, I walked up and down the banks a bit, looking for a log or some boards to cross on. There was nothing, which only made me think of Nikki's warning about avoiding places other people didn't want to be. I scoffed. Maybe that was the best place to be. For once, Nikki didn't know what she was talking about. After a few minutes, I was able to locate a fallen log and slide my way across it carefully. I almost tripped at one point and felt my heart rate increase dreadfully, despite how shallow the water below was. I told myself it was just because I didn't want to get in my car wet or bother with washing the car towel Nikki had insisted I get, but something in my head screamed for me to turn back. When I stood in front of the playhouse, it all felt worth it. Despite the peeling paint, chipping wood, and cracked glass, there was an odd and distinct beauty to the old place. It reminded me of a dollhouse I'd had as a kid. I stood there in the woods for a long time, just admiring it before I got up the courage to go closer. I snapped a picture and sent it to Nikki, but there was no cell service. When I finally entered the structure, the first thing I noticed was the simple wooden floor, and how clean it was, aside from some dirt and grass and a few small piles of leaves. That may not sound very clean, but if you've been in a lot of abandoned structures, you'll know what I mean. That's not just unusual, it's bizarre. I glanced up and saw that there was a small hatch in the ceiling with a simple rope ladder hanging down. The rope had frayed in the middle on one side and slightly higher up on the other, so it was cut and dangling. I put one hand on it and tugged, then decided it wasn't sturdy enough to support my body weight. Part of me was kind of proud of myself, even though I hadn't listened to Nikki when she asked me not to explore this place. I was still using her safety lessons. I figured if this went well, I could try and convince her to come back with me so she could see the place for herself. I snapped more pictures from the inside, the walls, the ceiling, the broken windows. After a moment, I noticed something in the pile of leaves and walked closer to investigate. It was a child's teacup set, perfectly intact and made from porcelain. I walked towards it like I was in a dream, and when I got there, noticed the wooden slats on the wall leading up to another hatch in the ceiling. I tested them, pushing down with one foot while I braced against the wall. When I told Nikki about it later, she said I should have used my hand or a stick instead, in case the wall collapsed. And when I had determined they were sturdy enough to hold me, I began to climb. When I got to the second floor of the playhouse, I nearly fell back to the ground floor in shock. Propped in one corner was a life-size doll of a man. It had a cloth body and porcelain head and hands. The face looked angry, with painted-on eyebrows and bright pink lips pulled down in a grimace, but the eyes looked more pained or afraid than angry. It was horribly unsettling, and I had to take a few minutes clinging to the wooden slats to catch my breath. After a moment, I realized I was hanging on pieces of rotting wood, at least 8 to 10 feet up from the ground. and I scrambled onto the floor. The room was small, probably 6 feet across in either direction, and this room had more detritus in it. I saw scraps of what looked like fancy children's dresses among the wreck from the roof having caved in. I couldn't tell for sure how old the playhouse was, but years of snow, wind, and rain had clearly taken a toll. There were boards and shingles all over the floor, and when I glanced up at the ceiling, I could see only a few structural beams, and only trees and sky beyond that. I looked back down at the floor and felt a little snake of worry wriggling in my stomach. If teenagers won't party here, then we shouldn't explore either. I shoved down my worry and kicked out at the crumbling wood beams on the floor, wanting to move them so I could see what was underneath. The smiling face of a little girl looked back at me from under the rubble, and I screamed, stumbling backwards and landing in the lap of the life-size doll. It wrapped its arms around me, and I screamed even harder, then burst into tears of relief when I realized the arms had just fallen on me. I crawled away from the doll and laid on the floor for a moment, alternating between laughing and crying until I felt something touch my ankle. It was a soft touch, so gentle I told myself I could pretend it didn't happen, but my stupid head turned of its own volition, looking down at my own foot almost accusingly. A tiny soft hand rested gently on my ankle, and I allowed my eyes to follow the hand up to the wrist, to the elbow, to the shoulder, and then to the tiny smiling face. I stared at it in horror, trying to process what I was seeing. There in the rubble was a little girl. She was the size of a very small child, and her skin was shiny and white like porcelain, but moved like regular skin. Her hair was pitch black, and her eyes were a shiny, happy blue. She stroked my ankle gently and asked, "Do you want to be my friend?" I don't know any other way to say this, but her voice was like porcelain too, delicate, bright, and oddly ethereal. I jerked my ankle away and crawled backwards like a crab, trying to put some distance between us. As soon as I did, her face fell, and for a moment I felt like the world's biggest monster. I said, I just want to go. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be here." Big tears welled up in her eyes as she said, "You don't want to play with me?" I was at a loss. On the one hand, a little girl had just crawled out of the rubble of a broken-down old playhouse in the middle of nowhere and was stroking my ankle like a creepy guy at a bar. On the other hand, apparently all she wanted was someone to play with, and I felt like kind of a massive jerk saying no to such a sweet request. I also felt like a massive fool for feeling bad instead of running away. I edged backwards again, and she asked, "Are you scared of me?" She slowly started crawling out of the rubble, revealing an equally doll-like body and strangely pristine pink, white, and blue dress. Instead of crawling towards me, she pulled herself up and walked over to the life-size doll on the floor. She pressed her hand to its cheek lovingly, and the doll's eyes flew open, revealing the real human eyes under the painted porcelain-looking ones. I screamed, and the doll opened its porcelain mouth as if to scream too. But the girl ripped her hand away, and the face went back to a painted porcelain mask. She said, "Daddy was always scared of me too." That was more than I could handle, and I threw myself down the open shaft with the rope ladder, giving myself some nasty rope burn as I used it to try and break my fall. I stumbled, fell, and heard a tiny porcelain voice say, "Don't run away. I'll have to make Daddy chase you." I decided to take that bet and sprinted out the door and through the shallow water, not stopping until I got back to my car. I fumbled the keys once, twice, before managing to get them in the door to unlock it, already sobbing in terror and relief as I slid in and locked the door behind me. I looked up to see a little girl holding the hand of the life-size doll, its head rolling limply on its shoulders, and I threw the car in reverse and backed out onto the road. I made it all the way home before I realized my cell was missing. It must have fallen out of my pocket when I ran away from the house. It was only a few hours before Nikki showed up at my house, looking pale and angry. She hugged me tightly and said, "What the hell, Mara? You went back without me." I burst into tears all over again and had to pull myself together to explain what had happened. When I was done, she said, "I don't think I'd be able to believe that story if you didn't look so scared right now. Did you take anything before you went out there?" I shook my head. I was stone cold sober, Nick. She nodded vaguely, just as her phone buzzed. She held it up to show that the message had come from my old number, the phone I had lost in the woods. I watched as she opened it up and showed me a picture of my car driving away from the playhouse. The darkness doesn't end here. Let's dive into another story, one that will haunt your dreams. The shadow in my apartment. I've always considered myself a rational person. But what happened to me in my small apartment last fall shattered that illusion. It started with a few odd occurrences. Things being moved from where I left them, faint noises in the dead of night, and a persistent feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I brushed it off as stress from work. I had just moved into this place, and settling in can be overwhelming. But as the weeks passed, the unsettling events escalated. One night, I woke up to the sound of soft whispers echoing in my bedroom. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone felt urgent, almost pleading. I froze, unable to move, my heart racing. When I mustered the courage to look around, there was nothing. Just the shadows cast by my bedside lamp. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But then, one evening, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning. My stomach dropped as I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I scanned the rooms, but everything seemed untouched. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The following week, I decided to stay up late to confront whatever it was that haunted my home. I placed a camera on my desk, hoping to capture any strange happenings. That night, I sat on my couch, surrounded by a fortress of pillows, my eyes glued to the dark corners of my apartment. Hours passed, with nothing but silence. Just as I was about to give up and turn in, I caught a glimpse of something on the camera. A fleeting shadow darted across the wall behind me, too quick to make sense of. I rewound the footage, heart pounding. There it was, a dark figure standing just out of the camera's frame, its shape human-like but distorted, almost melting into the shadows. It sent chills down my spine. I couldn't sleep that night. Desperate for answers, I reached out to the previous tenant. She seemed reluctant to talk, but eventually confessed that she had felt a presence in the apartment. Something that lingered in the corners, watching her. Her words made my blood run cold. I asked her if anything happened that made her leave, but she just shook her head, saying she didn't want to discuss it. Determined to rid myself of this shadow, I began researching local folklore and discovered stories about spirits that lingered in spaces of turmoil or distress. It seemed absurd, but I performed a cleansing ritual in my apartment, lighting sage and reciting calming affirmations. For a brief moment, I felt a weight lift, but that peace was short-lived. That night, I awoke to the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing beside me. I felt the mattress shift as if someone had sat down. My heart raced as I slowly turned to face the darkness, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence that filled the room. I thought I saw a fleeting glimpse of that same shadow lurking at the edge of my vision. The next day, I made the decision to leave the apartment. I couldn't take it anymore. As I packed my belongings, I noticed the camera footage was still recording. I hesitated before viewing it. As the video played, I watched myself packing, then froze as I saw the shadow again. This time, it was standing directly behind me, just out of sight of the camera. It leaned closer, its dark form almost tangible. I stumbled back, dropping the camera. I grabbed my things and left without looking back. I never returned, and I often wonder if that shadow still lurks in the corners of my old apartment, waiting for the next tenant to fill the silence. But if you think that was terrifying, just wait until you hear what happened next. Faced with fear, nightmarish. Jolting upright after a sleep's worth of squeamish dreams of sickness and sorrow, towards my phone I turned off the alarms that pierced my ears, seeming to hit my brain like stones. I hadn't slept well. This was not unusual by any means. Horrors from day to day, from global to personal, followed me to slumber and held me captive there till waking. However, now it was 4:30 a.m. Time to ready for the workday, which was a 13-hour shift at an oil pipeline, where I sat in my car as a gate guard. I'd gotten the gig 2 weeks ago, when the previous gate guard, who worked my spot, went missing. Easy job for the most part. I'm in Texas, so the heat is suffocating some days and for some hours, but the hardest part is keeping myself occupied, entertained, and sane. No meager feat. I begin my coffee's brew and pack my things. I dress, finish my coffee, brush my teeth, and head out the door. The night is a rich, deep dark, so black that I can't see anything around me. I unlock my car to trigger her headlights so I'm able to see my way to her. The drive is eerie, quiet, and puts me on edge. My headlights illuminate only just enough to see the way, and out of their reach and the beginnings of shadows, I swear I see a deer on the roadside. Except it looked like it had a human's face. I blink, and once my eyes are open again, I am passing where I thought the deer had stood. Nothing there now. The world's still asleep, the time just reaching 5:45 a.m. I arrive at my gate 15 minutes early. Fuck. I breathe out, irritated. I reach into my pocket and find the gate's keys, readying myself to unlock it. I'm already here 13 hours. Why did I leave 15 minutes earlier than usual today? I could have slept in if anything. I'm outside unlocking the gate, distracted by pissy thoughts, when a sound brings me to a pause. Talking. I hear talking somewhere in the pitch black. I can't distinguish the voice, nor place where it's coming from. Forest and brush surrounds me. No one is supposed to be out here this early with me. Hell, the gate ain't even unlocked yet, but I definitely hear a voice. Hey you. Someone whispers in the dark. Immediately my hairs are stood, and I shake with fear. I still can't place where it's coming from. Knots form in my stomach, tangling terror around my organs and spreading to my chest and throat. The voice sounded wrong. You, hey you. The voice jeers again, and I begin to understand my dread. The voice is familiar somehow, but distorted, and the emphasis is in the wrong parts of words, the cadence changing constantly. I'm still standing by the gate, unknown distance between me and the voice. I bite my fear and chew courage into my cheek, beginning to start towards my car when I see it. The deer, the one I'd seen on my way. My eyes are adjusted to the darkness enough to make it out just so. It stands inside the brush. Fright seizes my body, and I bite harder, cheek blood pooling into my mouth. The deer, which is not a deer, does indeed have a human face, a recognizable one. But before I'm able to process the face further, to decide it, the lips part and speak. You are bleeding. The voice moans, drawing out its words and changing their pitch in what I can only describe as excitement. The face's lips are parted, but they aren't moving to shape the words, rather just hanging open limply. The cheeks are gaunt, and there is an expression of pain and fear etched into the muscles. The eyes are wide open, but they look uncanny and wicked. I realize the face itself has no eyes, only holes in which another being looks through with its own judgments. The deer is wearing a human's face as a mask. My fear strengthens tenfold as I recognize the face as the missing gate guard, the man whose position I'd taken, the face which consumed every flyer, local social media post, and news outlet the last 2 weeks. I remember a post I'd seen of the man, made by his girlfriend. A video of them plays in my head, his laughter and speech ringing through it. This thing is wearing his face and parroting his voice. The deer steps forward once, my car's headlights revealing its form. The distance between us somehow significantly shortened, as though it had taken 20 steps instead. It looks less like a deer now in the light, but more so something sculpted from the memory of a deer. The proportions are off, and there are extra features and appendages. To my horror, a cloak wraps the thing's shoulders, made up of faces stitched skillfully with twine. I recognize many from missing posters throughout the years, faces of different ages, races, and identities sewn into a large, long sheet which blankets their collector. Slender humanoid arms emerge from beneath the cloak, and the hands reach up to the creature's face. It caresses the frame of the human mask gently, but doesn't remove it. Instead, it remains that way for a moment, stroking the skin almost lovingly. It never takes its eyes off me, nor mine it. I like this one, it finally croaks. One of the hands reaches towards me. Please, I request. The words don't hurt me dying in my throat. I taste blood on my lips and realize it has smeared across the lower half of my face from the wound in my cheek. The thing pauses, its eyes shut, and it breathes in deeply. After this, once its eyes open again, it is different, more intentional, calculated, and ready. Yours, however, is my favorite, it says, but the voice sounds different now. It sounds like mine, An obvious panic audible under the cheerful delivery. It gurgles and distorts as the thing speaks, but nonetheless, that voice is mine. Be careful with it. It extends its arm to meet my lips and presses a cold thumb into them to wipe away some of the blood. That is the last thing I remember before waking up on the ground, my back to the earth and face looking towards the sky. Feet stomp around me. Some run, some move quickly, and some frozen. I sit up and look around, seeing my supervisor, cops, and other gate guards moving around the vicinity. They are all serious, panicked even. Some call out my name. Hey! I try to call, but the words are caught inside my mouth, a muffled sound escaping me instead. I wave my hands around and stomp and try to force the words from me. No one seems to see me, and I am unheard. I don't fucking know, man, my supervisor grunts to a cop. Gate ain't even unlocked. Don't have a goddamn clue what could have happened. He should have been the only one out here. He gestures to keys on the ground, which are marked. I recognize them as my gate's keys. My hands fly to the pocket I keep them in, and of course find nothing. I stagger to my supervisor and grab his arm. I'm desperate to alert him. I am right here. He doesn't even feel me. In the reflection of his sunglasses, which hang from his collared uniform, I see myself there. I'm not sure how I'm able to accomplish this, as I have no eyes. I don't have any of my features. My face is gone. Movement reflects behind me, and I spin around. In the wood, I see faceless bodies disappear behind trees and bushes, hiding from what approaches me. The missing man's face has been quilted into the cloak, my face replacing the creature's old mask. An arm extends from the cloak, reaching towards its grace, its face and mimicking a falling tear with one finger, drawing the end of the gesture into a shh position on my lifeless lips. As darkness fell, their nightmare was only beginning. But they weren't the only ones haunted by shadows. What can Miss Mary help you with? We arrived at the hospital around 7:30 at night. Me, Jax, and my partners Ryan, a big quiet man, and Sydney, probably the most beautiful women I've ever met, get out of the all-black van, with the only noticeable marking being a logo with 3 arrows pointing towards themselves. The hospital itself had shut down around 30 years prior because of what was assumed to be an outbreak of some illness that was never identified, killing over half the patients in a night. It was only 1 floor, but still decently sized for the era it was made in. What used to most likely be a nice building was now moss-covered and mostly boarded up, located in the north part of Florida. We've arrived on site, I say into my radio as we start strapping on our plate carriers with 3 extra magazines for our AR-15s and clipping on our side holsters for our Glock 19s. And lastly, our helmets, only rated to stop small calibers but strong enough to take blunt force if necessary. And of course, NVGS with it being abandoned and all. 10-4 Jacks, we're not too sure what class this is, so proceed with caution. Great. Sydney says, knowing the potential danger, since we have almost no information other than that recently some explorers had went missing. Y'all know the drill. Search and rescue if they're alive, but our main objective is exterminating the anomaly. I say to my team. Ryan just nods his head, never being much of a talker, but most big guys aren't, and he was at least 6 feet 5 inches. Walking into the building, I say something into my radio, along the lines of, "We're entering the building." Flipping on the NVGS, the tall dark hallway lights up green as we start to enter. There's a front desk with a long hallway behind it that look to separate into 6 other small halls for the patient rooms and a kitchen on the far left side. Ignoring the kitchen, we start heading down the long hallway, planning to start from the back of the hospital and make our way up to the front as we step over broken glass and push empty beds out our way. We head to the end of the hall, planning to start on the side hall to the right, since the others seem to be mostly empty, with only what looks like the remains of the rehab part of the hospital. Heading down the hall, we stop at room 1 and see nothing inside or out. Pulling out my scanner to check the anomaly rating to see nothing's going off, which repeats for every room till we reach room 6, the last door on the right. Before opening the door, the device starts beeping like crazy. Silencing it, we all turn to each other and prepare to breach and enter the room. Me taking point, I slowly open the door, stepping into a room that looks like it was never abandoned. We did a double take and yet a completely normal-looking hospital room. Stepping in, we see nothing till we see a bathroom door, which we prepare to breach, as I hear something moving around in there. "I'll take point," I whisper, nodding to Sydney and Ryan, kicking the door open. I see what looks to be a 1980s-era looking nurse cleaning the bathroom. Hello," I say to the lady, who hasn't even turned around to acknowledge our presence. "Hello," I say louder, reaching to grab their shoulder and spin them around. But when I do, what turns around was almost normal, except the face, the hair, nails, body, everything about her. Or it was normal, at least for the time period we assume it's from. But the face, it had wide black eyes with a single white dot that I assume was its pupil, a mouth that hung open like something from the Evil Dead, and ears that leaked black goo, and a skull-like nose. It screeched an unholy sound as I stepped back, readying my rifle before it shoots. I guess shock waves from its mouth sending me flying out the door, slamming into the wall on the other side of the room. Sydney and Ryan step forward, raising their weapons, before Sydney's flies back, barely missing me, but not missing the wall, and Ryan's gun gets knocked out his hand as he reaches for his pistol. It grabs him, screaming into his ear as he tries to fight its grasp, but in a second he drops. Thinking quick, I grab Sydney and run out the room. "So physical isn't an option. He overpowered Ryan in a second?" Sydney says, as we run towards the middle of the long hall, looking for a spot to set up. "Yeah, we need to keep distance," I say as we flip a bed in the hall and hunker down, waiting for the creature to walk into sight. "My NVGS broke," Sydney says, frustrated. "Switch to flashlights," I say, flipping up the NVGs and clicking the button on the side of my rifle. The now lit hallway shows nothing but emptiness when we hear in a sing-songy voice, "What can Miss Mary help you with?" in a low, scraggly voice, which repeats over and over as we ready ourselves. We see it enter the hallway as we take aim and light the bastard up. It drops for about 10 seconds before slowly picking itself up, repeating, "What can Miss Mary help you with?" Rushing down the hall, we switch mags as it runs towards us, faster than any animal alive could. Jumping to the side, we see it rush past us and stops. We flick off our lights, hoping it would conceal us, as we slowly slide our back to the corner of the hall behind it. When I drop the old spent mag I had previously just used, when we see the creature not even flinch at the noise. Noticing, I lean down slowly and pick the mag up, and proceeded to throw it in the opposite direction, and see the creature still hasn't moved. I don't think it can hear us. I whisper to Sydney as we now are speed walking backwards down the hall, when the creature starts to turn and look around, presumably searching for us. Slipping into a room, we shut the door. "How are we getting out of this one?" Sydney says, looking at the barred windows. "I have no clue," I say, stepping towards the back wall. "One of us can try to distract it while the other lines up a shot," I say, looking into her eyes, wondering if after today I'll ever be able to express how I feel about her. "Look, I know it's dumb to think about this right now, especially with everything going on and it being against protocol, but how about a date if we make it out of this?" I say cautiously. "Sure, but you know that means we gotta kill this bitch," she says, smiling. "Okay," I say with newfound confidence. "I'll go distract it. You line up the shot," I say as I rush out the door, spraying shots at the creature down the opposite hall. Running towards the creature, it stretches its mouth wider and sprints towards me, screeching, "What can Miss Mary help you with?" Right before we collide in the middle of the hall, I turn left, shooting behind me as it chases me. I hear Sydney's feet running down the hall I just came from, diving to the ground. In front of me, I turn and spray the last of my mag into the creature's chest as Sydney runs up behind it, stuffing the barrel to the back of its head, and empties the gun. The creature drops as we start reloading our weapons. I pull out my pistol and put a few extra in just in case. We radio over Ryan's Kia, but we got the creature proceeding towards the entrance to await the cleanup crew. Walking away, we hear a faint, What can Miss Mary help you with?" Spinning around, the creature had already picked itself up and grabbed Sydney by the head, lifting her up. Charging the creature, I scream, "Put her down!" I try to tackle the beast before being knocked away, like I weigh less than a feather, and slamming the side of my body so hard into the wall, it cracks and breaks my arm. Yelling in pain, I look to see the creature slowly rip Sydney's head clean off as she screams and then silence. Sobbing, I lift myself up, clenching my arm. I sprint down the hall, only looking back for a second, but I wish I didn't. It was eating her. I turn the corner and slam my good arm into the door, busting out as soon as backup arrived. But I don't know how they fared against the creature. I passed out only after. I awoke to find myself back at home base, and that's everything I remember, Doc. Well, Jax, it seems you were very lucky. We'll ignore your breach of protocol given the fact you watched her die in front of you, but next time don't get so attached. Yes, sir, I said softly, clicking off the recorder in my pocket. At least everyone can know your sacrifice, Sydney, I whisper to myself before walking out. That tale may send shivers down your spine, but our next story will make your heart race even faster. A goofy trip. The sun was slowly sinking behind the tree line in the distance, disappearing behind the horizon and covering the forest in a dark blanket. I had parked my car on the small concrete slab next to the area's informational sign, which read Spoonersville National Park. Now I was hiking across the small heath separating me from the dark, tall pines. After about half an hour of walking, I found a clearing that looked spacious enough for a tent and a fire pit. By the time the last of the sun's rays had disappeared from the woods, I was sitting by the fire in front of my tent. The wind was slowly blowing through the dark, tall trees around me. It almost sounded like the whole forest was whispering, yet somehow I did not find it spooky, but weirdly calming. I had been a part of the Boy Scouts for most of my childhood, which introduced me to the likes of sleeping in tents, gathering wood, and cooking on open fire. Once I was 18 years of age, there were no more groups for me to join, so I had been offered to become one of the troop leaders, passing my knowledge on to the new generations and all that. But college life had me too busy, so I had to decline. I did miss being out in nature, though, and that's why I decided to make it a little tradition to go out on trips like the one I was on now every year. It wasn't a cold night per se, but the fire kept the chilly air away, so I stood up and grabbed my flashlight to go find some more wood for my fire. It only took me a minute to find a nice, small pine log. I let my hand run over the exposed core of the log to check if it was dry, but the second I reached down, I heard something fly right over my back and hit a tree behind me. I shot back up and looked behind me. Now I was no stranger to bats or owls, but them flying this close? Had I set up near a nesting ground? Surely not, since a bird would have surely hooted, screeched, or cawed me away long before I would have gotten even close to its eggs. Scanning the forest behind me only revealed a really big brown shoe with a hole in the bottom. It must have been at least size 18 and a half, stuck to one of the trees. It was probably left there by another camper to mark something, although I hadn't noticed it when I was putting my tent up. With no sign of the flying assailant, I grabbed a couple more small logs and branches to pile up on the orange autumn needles on the forest floor. Although these trips usually took place in the summer, I had been working extensively this year to save up for a car, so I could finally travel longer distances without relying on public transport. This did mean, however, that I had to move my trip to a random weekend, somewhere in October. This didn't really bother me, since apart from the shorter days and rainier weather, the temperature was pretty similar. After I got tired of staring at the dancing flames turning into still embers, it was time to kick some sand on the charred logs and to crawl into my sleeping bag. I was well on my way to some sweet dreams when I was awakened by the beeping of my watch. Beep, 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 beep. October 13th, it read, Hallows Eve. Stupid default alarms. I pressed mute and rolled over again. I'll have to update it and turn those holiday notifications off when I get back home. Maybe 2 or 3 hours later, I was rudely awoken by another alarm. I checked my watch, but its screen was gray and dull. I listened closely and heard it again. It wasn't a beeping alarm, but more of a giggle, no, a cry or a call. It sounded like a sob, but animalistic. Yuck. Yes, that seemed the closed, like the sound someone makes in an old cartoon when they see Brussels sprouts or cabbage. Yuck, yuck. 3 cries and the forest went silent again. Even though it was sad, it gave me chills. Was it a stray wolf? A coyote even? Did they even live this far north? After a couple minutes, that seemed like an eternity. The cries seemed to stop. I crawled over to the zipper of my tent, slowly peered through the teeth, and pointed my flashlight outward. Slowly, I scanned the trees around me, in the direction the sound seemed to come from. Except for a few birds, there were no signs of life anywhere, until I looked beneath me. There, on the orange needles, a small, weathered toy laid next to my tent. It seemed to resemble a mouse, I think. It was a soft, fabric-covered black ball with two round discs resembling ears. On the bottom, a black, flexible tube had been attached, connected to a small yellow shoe. This definitely had not been here before. Did it fall from a tree? Did the wind blow it here? Did someone from college follow me to play a prank on me? Picking the toy up and turning it around revealed a small wind-up gear with a badly scribbled note that read, "Twist me," stitched above it. I half expected the thing to just play an hour loop of "Never Gonna Give You Up" or that annoying bird laughing, but when I released the gear, I couldn't place the tune at first. It took me a couple of seconds, but when I heard an extremely distorted hot dog, I realized what it was. It was one thing for someone to go out of their way to secretly follow me and drop a weird recording toy in front of my tent, but to add a distorted version of the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse theme? Even that went too far for my friends. Although maybe Tom would go far enough, but he would be competing in his rowboating tournament halfway across the world by now. Did he make that up? No. And besides, the distorted audio loop didn't sound faked. It genuinely sounded like it was once a vibrant and happy tune that had been played and worn over time to the point where it had gotten creepy. Much more time to ponder on the hows and whys was not given to me, for as soon as the crooked music box stopped playing, I heard something scurrying behind my tent, followed by a huck. Yuck. It didn't take me a second to decide what to do. My fight or flight response kicked in, and I chose flight. Quite literally, as I nearly flew through the trees. I must have sprinted the full 30-minute walk to the heath in 5 minutes max. Usually I would get winded after a minute or two, but I had only one thought on my mind: run. Once I was out of the woods, I shined my flashlight behind me and glanced over my shoulder. There was no sign of whatever was making that noise yet, but I could feel something behind me in the forest. I practically jumped to my car when I reached the concrete. I looked around, nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief and reached into my pocket. At that moment, my head showed me attaching my car keys to a ring on my backpack, which I had left in the tent before crossing the heath. My hand, of course, grabbed nothing as my keys weren't there. I took some deep breaths, manned up, and made myself big. As long as I shine my flashlight in its eyes, appear big, scary, and don't get too close, an animal should keep its distance. I took a couple of paces out from my car, back onto the heath, all the while talking myself up. It's just an animal. I'll get my keys and sleep in the car. I just overreacted. It probably found the toy somewhere and decided to carry it around, and simple dropped it when sniffing around my campsite. Yeah. It's probably just a dog who got left, and that toy is its only plaything. But when I turned around halfway across the heath to look at my car, I saw no dog. The heath wasn't a long stretch of land, maybe about half a football field, at least enough as to be able to see what was standing on top of my old car, illuminated by the moonlight. I stopped breathing. A tall man stood on the roof of my car. His head was painted black, but his face had a weird light beige color, making it look like a flat snout. His ears were elongated and thin, like that of a dingo. His chest was fully painted orange, and he only wore a filthy black, open sleeveless jacket. He wore short jeans and had his lower legs painted in a similar blue. Beneath it were huge, brown size 18 shoes, which his black toes stuck through the noses of. I wanted to freeze, to close my eyes and forget this monstrosity, but I was much more afraid of its intentions than of its looks. And so I spun myself around, running back towards the forest, and before I entered, I glanced over my shoulder, needing to know why that thing was chasing me. It was. With big, freakish passes, was it quickly closing the distance between us. I swung my head back in the direction I was going, and too late. I had realized too late that there was a tree in front of me, and so, a second after looking in front of me, I collided with it, and even the moon went dark. When I came to my senses, Every bone in my body ached and my skin itched like I was wearing a terrible grandmother's sweater all over. But I would have taken an itchy sweater over this any day, because I was wearing some sort of pale, decrepit yellow suit. It was a completely yellow sweater, pants and 2 pairs of socks, one on my feet and one on my hands. They were all stitched together and incredibly tight. Around my neck there was a thick metal collar, which in turn was chained to a tree nearby. So escape was no option. I looked around me. Between the trees, a giant fabric roof had been fashioned from at last 20 or so sewn together tents. On the edge I could see what had, until recently, been my tent. There was a fire going beneath the middle of the tents, where a hole had been cut for the smoke. On it was a big kettle, with steam rising out of it. In the corner there lay a pile of backpacks. Where are these from other people? Where are they? Before I could walk around a bit more, I heard huck huck, getting louder and louder. The thing was even scarier in the daylight. It had a large black hole for a nose and 2 demonic, purely black eyes. Its mouth looked like it had been pulled outward and contained only 2 stained yellowed teeth. Its earlobes had clearly been pulled out into long, thin strips, and its clothes seemed even more foul than before. They had dark, brown and red stains on them. The next few days of my life were a living hell. The thing would feed me the stew in the cauldron, putting a small wooden bowl of it within the reach of my chain. The broth was dark and thick. It never seemed to sleep, and rarely stopped around its camp. When it did, it was only to feed me or to hide behind trees and watch me. At night, it would force me to play the distorted tune from the toy. The melody haunted my dreams and the monster my waking moments. But whenever my tormentor wasn't mentally scarring me, I checked around the camp. I could see into the big cauldron, and the amount of mystery soup in it seemed to slowly decrease by the day. He never touched the bags, but I could in no way reach them. 6 days. After 6 days, I found some hope. The thing had left a tent pin in one of the roof pieces. Whenever I could, I threw pine cones up. Some would hit, most would miss. It took a couple hits, but eventually the thin metal pin came down. I pondered what to do with it. Stab the thing? Pry open my chains? I grabbed the pointy end and started breaking away the fibers of the tree my chain was attached to. The tree was pretty thick, and the haunting presence of the beast made it no easier. I covered my progress with bark and hid the tool in the forest ground. Slowly but surely was I getting through the tree. I knew once I were to reach halfway through the trunk, I might be able to push it over. Then I'd only have to cut through whatever tendons of fiber were left holding the tree together. For 3 more days I had to carefully chip away the tree, splinters at a time, making sure the tree was getting as weak as possible without it falling over. I woke up on a misty morning. The sun still hung low on the horizon, and the woods were slowly awakening. There was no sign of it. This was my moment. I pushed the tree over and quickly tried softening its fall on the other side. When it hit the ground with a thud, I took a minute to listen. Surely it wouldn't come investigate a falling tree. When the forest remained quiet, I rushed over to the backpacks. They were all nearly empty, apart from a pocket knife, a compass, and a plastic bottle. I took them and rushed over to the cauldron to have at least some hydration with me. But as I got close to the fire pit for the first time, I dropped my yaw in horror. There were no stones surrounding the burnt wood. What I thought had been round stones was actually a perfectly arranged circle of human skulls. I slowly approached the cauldron and saw it was nearly empty. Nearly. Lining the bottom of the iron pot, there were a ridiculous amount of small, broken, and splintered human bones. I knew for sure because some finger bones still had rings on them. I had found the owners of all those tents. There was not a single bone in my own body that didn't want to drop to the floor and start weeping. But I couldn't. I had to get out now. The plastic bottle fell to the floor as I bolted away into the trees. I had to get at least as far away as possible. After 5 minutes, I started walking at a slower pace. Safety was who knows how far away, and I still had to make it there. I tried to stick to heading south, as most big cities close to my original camping ground were in that direction. I figured the beast wouldn't have taken me far, or hoped at least. Right before the night befell the forest, I felt tears in my eyes. There were lights in the distance, not fire nor stars. No, electrical lights, homes, a town, safety. I closed in on the buildings and knocked on the first door I saw a light behind. A kind, elderly lady let me in and helped me call emergency services. And now, after many months of therapy sessions, mental health and meds, I've finally been able to sleep again. My therapist told me I should try to tell my story to a broader audience, that it would help show that the delusions from being alone in the wild for so long were no more than that. It would help me realizing that I simply had a breakdown on a camping trip and ran off into the woods. For now, I will need to get my life back together. I had lost my collage apartment and my belongings had been thrown out due to my absence. The police could find no evidence of a place called Spoonersville National Park. It seemed to have disappeared along with my car. So now I live in a small home for the mental help. But they are going to help me get a place somewhere soon, they said. Someone brought me a gift last night, a sturdy black ball with 2 soft mouse ears and a tail with a boot on it. It plays a cheery tune when you twist a gear on the back of it. I think I will go shopping tomorrow. Maybe I'll get one of those warm, black, sleeveless jackets. Yuck! While they were left wondering who or what was out there, another story was unraveling, one even more sinister. My childhood holds a dark secret, and now I have to face it. 1. I don't dream often, but even when I do, I don't ponder my dreams. To me, they're the brain's way of coping with the reality we live in, giving us condensed and digestible images or films to help us understand the stress we deal with daily. However, there are times when, after having a dream, something happens in the real world that, well, to put it plainly, correlates directly with the dream I had while in the world of slumber. Those are the dreams I pay attention to. They're deeper than déjà vu, more like a premonition of things to come. I'd be lying if I said this happened to me often. I'm not claiming to be some kind of psychic. But regarding the dream I just had, I remember seemingly important parts as clear as glass. But just like any dream, there are segments that I can't recall. It's what I imagine someone who has just woken up from surgery feels. They're aware they had surgery, but don't know the details. The beginning of the dream is clear to me. I was standing, staring blankly at the end of an aisle of a store. It took me a moment to figure out where I was, but after looking down the narrow aisle and seeing that it was lined with toys, I realized I was in a toy store. My blank expression broke into a glee-filled smile as I excitedly waltzed down the aisle. From what I gathered from this first part of the dream, I'm no older than 7 or 8. My happy expression only intensified when I saw that I was in the train section. I remember loving Thomas the Tank Engine around this age, so I wasted no time exploring the aisle. I probably watched Thomas and the Magic Railroad to exhaustion, and I used to wear a little train conductor outfit everywhere I went, even to bed sometimes. The feeling I had looking through the trains in the aisle is what I suspect an alcoholic feels entering a liquor store and browsing the bottles. After what felt like an eternity of getting lost among the wooden train engines, track sets, and toy tunnels, I finally found something that made all the other toys on the aisle, in my kid mind, feel irrelevant. A rare special edition Golden Thomas. My focus was broken by a voice from the end of the aisle. "That's pretty cool." It caught me off guard, and I jumped a little. I looked to my right and saw a little girl, about my age. She was wearing a navy blue dress with a matching hairband holding back her curly, dirty blonde hair, and her eyes were soft and friendly. "Oh, hi," I said, nearly shouting, showcasing that she had scared me. She stifled a giggle at my outburst. I tried to recover and play it cool. "Oh, hi, I didn't see you there," I said in a pathetic attempt at cool-headedness. I knew it didn't work when she giggled again. "My name is Wendy, the train." "It's cool," she said as she laughed. "What?" I said cluelessly. "Oh, yeah, I've wanted it forever. I've only seen it in commercials. Even his face is gold." "It's cool because normal Thomas has a gray face," I said, feeling a little nerdy. "Oh, my name is Chris," I added quickly. She walked over and stood next to me, turning to face the wall of trains that I was looking at. Now that she was closer to me, I could see just how pale her skin was, like she hadn't seen the sun in years. "She's my favorite," Wendy said, pointing to a train above the Golden Thomas. It was Lady, the new character from the Magic Railroad. Yeah, she's pretty cool, I said, thinking to myself that the Golden Thomas was way cooler. She replied with a strange response, or at least odd for a 6-year-old. She said, "They just got these this morning when freight came in on the truck." She sighed deeply. Just in time for the holiday shopping season. The funny thing is, I bet half the associates aren't even aware they're in yet. Worse yet, I don't even think they know it's Black Friday tomorrow. Nobody, and I mean nobody, pays attention around here. I looked at her as though she had spoken to me in Latin. Huh, I said, confused. I had never heard a kid my age speak like an adult before, but instead of trying to play it off, she just turned to me and said, "I know a really cool place we can go where we can watch the Magic Railroad." "Really? Where?" I said excitedly. She giggled and took me by the hand. "Come on, I'll show you." We both ran out of the aisle and out of the toy store. It was then that I realized we were in a mall, and the toy store was just one of many stores. We ran and skipped together down the huge main hallway of the mall, with stores having their lights off on either side of us, as if they were closed. Somehow, it didn't shock me that we were the only ones there. I knew the mall was closed, and I just didn't care. We ran until we came to the end of the hall, where there was a Regal movie theater. It was open, and the lights were on, unlike the other stores, but their glow didn't seem to illuminate that shadowy corner of the mall. The red, blue, and purple neon lights surrounding the entrance to the theater reflected off the mall's tile flooring I was walking on. Sure enough, there was a poster advertising the Thomas movie upon entering the theater. I looked around a little. Everything seemed so familiar. The dim lighting, the weird carpet with a squiggly pattern all over it, the concession area, and the smell of popcorn. I ran over to the candy rack and just looked over all the different snacks they had. Wendy was standing in my periphery, seemingly looking at the snacks too. I spotted a pack of Twizzlers and went to grab it. Wendy suddenly whipped around quickly to face me, almost like she was on a swivel. Her speed shocked me, and I was about to laugh it off when I looked up and saw her face. Her brown eyes were now milky, sunken, and cold, their warmth having left them. The little remaining color in her face was now gone, leaving it nearly gray, and her skin almost seemed like cracked porcelain. Her mouth was gaping open like some rabid animal. Without moving her open mouth, a sound came out of it like a speaker. In fact, now that I think about it, it did sound like an old recording with the background static and grainy audio. She said, "Stealing is bad. Don't do it or else. Then it ended as if it had been cut off. I think she could see the fear in my expression because the color in her face returned and her eyes became normal again. She apologized, looking down at her feet as though she was embarrassed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry," she said softly, sounding as if she were about to cry. It took a couple of seconds, but my fear subsided, and after a moment of awkward silence, I said timidly, It's okay." For some reason, I felt bad for her. She didn't look back up at me, and I could tell she was crying now. I didn't really know what to do, but I wanted her to know it was okay. So I went to put my hand on her shoulder. Suddenly, before I could touch her, her whole body twitched dramatically once. I could see her skin was deathly white again, and even with her hair obscuring her face, between the gaps in her blonde locks, one milky gray eye pierced my soul. I just stood in utter petrification as she whispered, "You can never leave Neverland." I was terrified. I didn't know what to do, so I began to slowly back away. Once I had stepped away, I was able to see something standing far behind Wendy down the hallway leading to the individual theaters. It was a shadow. Not Wendy's shadow, but someone else's. Suddenly, Wendy glided out of view silently and without moving a muscle. It was as though she had frozen into a statue, and the floor beneath her had become ice. She glided away from me quickly and without losing momentum. She dissolved into the dark corridor with that tall shadow. The last thing I saw of Wendy was her glaring eye before it too disappeared. I was in shock. My kid brain was trying to grasp what was happening but failing. Now, I could see the shadow in its fullness. It was the silhouette of a tall, skinny woman with thin, stringy hair and wearing a tattered nightgown, or maybe a dress. I could make out no other details except her eyes. They were open wide and wild, almost glowing white from reflecting the neon lights. She was staring at me, silently watching. At that, I sprinted out of the theater. I was too scared to make a sound. I wanted to shout for my mother, but I couldn't bring myself to yell. What if that girl, or whatever she was, heard me? She'd find me again, glide towards me, and then... Oh God, where was my mom? This is where my memory fails me a little. I don't know what happened, but somehow, after running around for a while, I arrived back in the toy store and at the train aisle. The girl, or anyone else for that matter, was nowhere to be found. I was alone. I stood still, catching my breath for a moment when the allure of the Golden Thomas captured me again. I cautiously entered the aisle, but once I could see the golden train on the shelf, all apprehension left me. That girl was crazy, I thought to myself. I wasn't going to steal anything. Why would I steal when I could just ask my mom? I was a little worried that I couldn't find my mom, but I was sure she was around there somewhere. I walked over, and I reached out to grab the train. Immediately, when my fingers grasped the toy's box, everything around me changed. It was as if I were in a movie, and I had just been placed in a new scene. I was leaving the toy store again and entering back into the larger structure of the mall. I was holding someone's hand, and they were pulling me forward, but not enough for it to hurt. Assuming it to be my mom, I first looked to see if I had the Golden Thomas, but there was nothing in my hands. I looked up to ask if my mom had it, only to realize that whoever had my hand was not my mother. I saw only a figure dressed in white and black. At first, I didn't know how to react until I saw that this thing wasn't taking me to a different store. It was instead leading me toward a rusted white door with the paint chipping off. I panicked and began to scream. "Mom, help! No, Mom, I don't know who this is. Help!" But as I cried and struggled, the figure only gripped me harder and walked faster. At that moment, a sound came from the loudspeakers in the mall. Or else. It was that girl, Wendy. It repeated like that twice, being cut off at the end. But the third time, it finished. Or else Captain Hook will get you, Peter. Run, Peter. I was being pulled so hard toward the rusted door now that I thought my arm would dislocate. But no matter how hard I fought back, the black and white figure dragged me closer. My heart felt like it would pound out of my chest, and I continued to scream. "Stop! Please, Mom! Somebody help!" From beyond the rusted door, I could hear a muffled sound. It became clearer as I was being dragged closer. Carnival music. It was out-of-tune carnival music, or at least something resembling that. The door swung open, and the doorway led only to pitch darkness. From within the darkness, I heard the music clearly. It was a haunting rendition of A Pirate's Life for Me, accompanied by what was either the sound of kids screaming in glee or screaming in terror. It was impossible to distinguish. All effort to escape was hopeless. The stranger, Captain Hook, pulled me into the darkness. The sound of the ghostly music and the children was instantly replaced by the sound of a phone ringing. It was my phone. It jolted me awake, and I was freed from the grasp of the nightmare. I immediately turned over to face my nightstand where my phone was. I grabbed it and was blinded by its brightness. My brain was still fuzzy from sleep, so this felt like a flashbang. Through my tired, squinted eyes, I saw that it was an unknown number, and I typically let those go to voicemail. Still, as an adult, I don't like talking to strangers. Upset that this person had just interrupted my sleep, as horrifying as my nightmare was, I slammed my thumb down dramatically on the red icon. I placed it back on my nightstand and rolled over. I wasn't tired anymore. That dream, and then my phone was like an instant shot of espresso topped off with adrenaline. I lay there for a little while, just thinking and mulling over my thoughts, mulling over the dream. Through my blinds, I could see that it was morning time, so after a little more time in bed, I decided to get up and start my day. No use waiting for my alarm. After letting my dog out and getting ready for work, I checked my phone and saw that I had indeed been left a voicemail. I told myself I would listen to it after I got off from work. I put my phone in my pocket, said bye to my pup, and left the house. All day at work, I felt off, like there was a growing anxiety within me, in my core. I work at a warehouse, and my job is to basically stack pallets of product, wrap the pallet in plastic, and get it ready to ship out on a truck. It's a job that requires some attentiveness. But all day, I was spacing out, having daydreams, almost like I was in an anxious haze. Yet I couldn't pinpoint the source of the anxiety. At lunch, I sat in the cafeteria on site just staring at my ramen. I was hungry, but I was too caught up in my own head to want to eat. "You okay there, Chris?" My head shot up to see my manager, John, sitting across the table from me. "You okay, man? You don't look too good." Yeah, I'm fine. I just didn't sleep very well, last night, I mean. But I'm fine," I said, nearly stuttering. I could tell that John knew something was up that I wasn't telling him by the way he looked at me. "Look, I'm overstaffed today, just not enough freight coming in," John said. "You look like you could use a day. Plus, it's Friday. Why don't you take the rest of the day off?" I was hesitant to accept. I felt guilty leaving. But John didn't really phrase it as a question, so I obliged. When I arrived home, I was greeted by my dog, a pit bull Labrador mutt named Diana. While I usually reciprocate her greeting, I was in such a daze that I didn't acknowledge her at all. She immediately could tell something was off about me. She even started acting shady towards me, keeping her distance and side-eyeing me. I was exhausted, so I just went upstairs to bed. It was strange. As I went up my stairs, I couldn't help but notice that the darker areas of my house were noticeably duller. I collapsed onto my bed with my shoes still on and almost instantly fell into a dreamless sleep. I woke up the next day at 6 a.m. I had slept for over 12 hours. After that, my weekend went fine. Nothing really noteworthy happened, to be honest. I mostly just sat around, and at some point, I wrote down my nightmare in my journal while I watched Friends. On Monday, 3 days after the incident at work, I was leaving work and sitting in my car, about to drive out of the parking lot, when I remembered the voicemail. I pulled it up on my phone and listened. "Hi, Chris. This is Detective Connor Davidson with the Richland Police Department. Do you remember me? I know has it been 3 years already? Damn. Anyway, would you mind calling me back when you get this? I have an update, thanks." I was in a little shock. I hadn't heard Connor's voice in a long time, not since I had lived in Richland, Washington 3 years prior. Not since all those horrible things happened. Sitting in my car, my mind was reeling after hearing Connor's voice. I was fixated on the phrase, "I have an update." Over and over again, it repeated in my mind, and a lump formed in my throat as I pressed the return call icon on my phone. The phone rang twice, and then Connor answered. "Detective Davidson," he said. For a second, I didn't say anything, unsure how to even introduce myself because my brain was so occupied. "Hello?" Connor broke the awkward silence. I finally spat something out. "Hi, Connor. It's Chris. Jackson. You called me a couple of days ago with an update?" Connor's voice immediately became friendly and full of recognition. "Oh, hey man. How's it going? It's been a long time." "I'm okay," I said. Connor's cordialness broke me out of my weird mindset. "It has been a long time. Last we talked, it was Officer Davidson, I believe. You must like the pay raise." "Oh yeah, it's great. I can actually afford my car payment and groceries." We both chuckled. "How do you like being a detective?" I asked. "It's pretty great, to be honest. I basically get paid to write reports and eat donuts at the station," he said, obviously joking. "I bet in a town like Richland, there's not a whole lot of action," I said with a laugh. There was silence on his end of the phone after I said that. It seemed I had reminded him of the reason he reached out to me in the first place. "Have you been keeping up on the news here?" I no longer lived in Richland, so I hadn't. "No? What happened?" I asked, but I had a feeling I knew what the news was, praying that I was wrong, praying that it wasn't happening again. "We got him," he said. "We caught James Reese." I was once again in shock. I was speechless. I was wrong. My fear indeed did revolve around James, but that he had resurged and was killing again, not that he had been caught. Connor continued as I had nothing to say. Late last Thursday, a police station in Baker City received an anonymous tip that he was hiding in an abandoned house. They pursued it, and, well, it turned out to be true. They took him into custody Friday morning. "Baker City? Like, you mean Oregon?" I asked. "Of all places," Connor replied. "The state agreed to extradite him here to Benton County for prosecution." I still didn't know what to say. I just blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. "Why?" I said. "Why?" Connor repeated, as if to say, "What do you mean, why?" "Why are you telling me this, Connor? I don't want to know this." Connor sighed sympathetically, almost regretfully. This case is moving fast. He's going to appear in court sooner than later. And unfortunately, you're a key witness to what happened, Chris. It's more likely than not that you're going to be called on to testify when he is brought before the judge. And seeing that I've been made lead investigator on the case, I thought I would give you a heads up before an attorney did it first. Now I understood. Thanks, I said dryly. We talked for a little longer, catching up and making pleasantries. After we hung up, I just sat in the silence of my car, contemplating and dreading the fact that I was going to have to dig up memories I had worked hard to bury. The skeletons in my closet had been stirred up. I grew up in a small but growing urban town called Richland in the southern region of Washington state, known as the Columbia Basin. Richland sits south of the Columbia River, with its bank running parallel to the town. Richland is actually one of 3 small cities that are cradled up to the coast. On the north side of the Columbia River is Pasco, which mostly consists of agriculture and farmland, with some suburban areas sprinkled in. Then, south of the Columbia are Kennewick and Richland. The 2 small cities are separated by a line only visible on a map. Together, all 3 towns create an area known as the Tri-Cities. When one thinks of Washington state, the first thing that usually comes to mind is a whole ton of evergreen trees. And for the most part, they'd be right. However, the Tri-Cities breaks that reputation. It is built on a low desert full of sagebrush, treeless hills, and tall dry grass. This is exactly why Oppenheimer and his team chose an area just north of Richland called Hanford to stage the plutonium production for the Manhattan Project. And that's basically as far as the hometown pride goes. I've actually heard the whole Columbia Basin area referred to as Washington's asshole. Perhaps that's also why some people like to call it the Tri-Cities. I digress. Basically, there isn't a whole lot to do in that sleepy town. But the main hubs for activity are as follows. The Uptown Strip Mall, best known for the Spud Nut Shop where they sell some of the best donuts on the planet. A baseball stadium, known as the Dust Devil Stadium, home of, you guessed it, the Tri-City Dust Devils, the Columbia River, where everyone spends their summers either swimming, watching boat races, or running on the trails along the riverside. And lastly, the Columbia Center Mall, which sits almost directly in the middle of all 3 cities. To be honest, it's a boring town full of quiet people. That's probably why I was able to get away with so much as a kid. I wouldn't say I was a troublemaker as a child, but I wasn't what anyone would describe as quiet. Neither were my brother, Jesse, and my cousin, Isaiah. Isaiah and I were less cousins and more brothers. We were born the same year, although 6 months apart. We went to school together, church together, lived in the same neighborhood, and spent almost as much time together as Jesse and I did. But we were pretty rambunctious, and when Isaiah and I were together, no one could keep us still, and manners were out the window. Growing up Orthodox Christian, my Pias parents and my aunt and uncle had a hell of a time keeping our rowdy nature at bay during church. For example, one time when Isaiah and I were around 5, he snuck his hamster, Hammy, to church. His parents had just gotten it for him for his birthday that past weekend, and he didn't want to leave without it. But while we were in line to receive communion, Hammy wriggled out of Isaiah's shirt pocket and got loose in the church. There was pandemonium in the chapel. The old ladies and the girls were screaming, and the boys were trying to catch the rodent. Father Andrew was finally able to let Hammy out by opening the doors of the chapel. We thought it was so funny, and Isaiah and I were giggling through the entire ordeal until our parents got a hold of us. Not only did our parents make us apologize to the entire congregation and to Father Andrew, but Isaiah never saw Hammy again. The summer of 2000 was probably the first time my parents gave me any real freedom. I turned 8 in June, and for my birthday, my mom, instead of money in my birthday card, gave me 3 year-round bus passes for the transit. She told me that one of them was for me, and the other 2 were for Isaiah and Jesse. Basically, I was given full access to transportation around the Tri-Cities. The only restrictions were that I had to tell my mom where I was going and when I would be back. And I had to take Jesse and Isaiah with me, especially Jesse because he was 13. In the 90s and early 2000s, the Tri-Cities was considered to be one of the safest places in Washington state. So this wasn't reckless parenting. And my mom was also well aware that we were going to stick to places like parks, the public pool, the library, and the mall. I remember that we would get into our swimsuits and hop on the bus heading into the heart of Richland. There was a park right next to the riverside called Howard Amon Park, and it was right down the street from the uptown. When we got off the bus, we'd first pick a spot, a home base, as it were, usually a picnic table. We'd throw our backpacks in a pile, strip our shirts off, exposing our white as sour cream complexion, and run like the lifeguards from Baywatch into the cold Columbia water. But in the summer heat, it was so refreshing. I remember playing King of the Hill with Isaiah and Jesse, trying to wrestle each other off the dock and making each other do the truffle shuffle before jumping into the water. We would walk in the shallower areas looking for small fish and lost change. Once I even thought I found a skull along the shore, but it was only a large rock that looked like a skull. Isaiah was really into the summer reading programs the libraries hosted, and so occasionally we would stop at the library. I, however, mostly went for the comic books. Of course, the public pool was a favorite of ours, although the real reason we went was because the ice cream truck would make a drive by the pool nearly every hour. So between the parks along the river, the library, and the pool, we had our summer regular haunts. But that all changed when I saw on the TV in our living room that the Columbia Center Mall was hosting Free Ticket Friday at the Regal Cinema. And with the release of Thomas and the Magic Railroad, I had to go to the mall. I remember my 8-year-old self feeling like he would combust if I didn't go, but my dreams were soon crushed when no one would go with me. Jesse didn't want to sit through a movie he described as gay as and Isaiah obviously couldn't go if Jesse didn't. My dad was always at work, so my only hope was my mom. When I went to my mom, I felt a little like a salesman. She was cleaning dishes at the sink, and I was eating a PB&J she had made me at the counter. And I remember feeling like this was the most important thing to me. "Hey, Mom," I said, with some sandwich still in my mouth. She looked over at me, soap still on her hands. "Have you heard of Free Ticket Friday?" She shook her head. "No, I haven't." "What is it?" I had her hooked, so I made my pitch. "It's this really cool thing at the mall where if you buy one movie ticket, you get one for free. And I was wondering if we could go see the new Thomas movie? Is that okay if we do that?" I said all in one breath. She looked at me with faux contemplation. Just you and me?" she asked. I nodded. She made a coy face, like a mom-son date. I cringed. "If you want to call it that, I guess." My mom snickered. "I'm kidding, kiddo. If you keep your room clean all this week, then I think that's a great idea, hon. We can go this weekend." I got up from the counter and ran to hug my mom. "Thanks, Mom," I said. She laughed and splashed water on me. Friday couldn't have come soon enough, and all week I was thinking about the Thomas movie. When it finally came, I almost pushed my mom out of the house and into the car. It wasn't a long car ride. We lived within walking distance of the mall, but my childlike impatience made the drive feel like an eternity. When we pulled up to the theater side of the mall, I saw the poster for the Magic Railroad displayed on the outside of the theater. And at that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. But, even as a child, something about the mall complex felt industrial, almost oppressively so. There was a faint hum of machinery that was ever present but never really seen. To describe the mall without going into monotonous detail, it's a single-story and very spread-out building. It's formed into a shape that resembles a strange letter K. And the Regal Cinema was at the top of the K on the north side of the mall. When we walked into the entrance of the mall that led to the theater, I could see an advertisement poster saying, "Don't miss out on Free Ticket Friday. It's BOGO on all tickets, happening every Friday and going all summer long, only at the Regal Cinema in Columbia Center." The poster itself seemed a bit off, the colors slightly faded and the edges curling, as if it had been there for much longer than just a summer. Maybe it was just reused from last year. "2 tickets for Thomas and the Magic Railroad, please," my mom said once we got to the ticket booth. The attendant typed something on his register. "It's for Free Ticket Friday," I blurted out. My mom chuckled. "He knows, sweetheart." I don't remember much about the attendant. I think there was a glare or something on the glass at the ticket booth, so I couldn't get a good look at his face. He wore a white polo shirt and a black bow tie with black pants, and his name tag, instead of a name, just said Usher, just like the rest of the employees. What differentiated the man selling us tickets was that he had a small pin on his shirt right below the name tag. It was Tinkerbell. I remember it so clearly because after my mom had the tickets and we were about to go inside, I said to him, "I like your Tinkerbell pin." The man didn't say anything back to me, though. He just looked at me. Even through the light-polluted glass, I could feel him staring at me as my mom and I went in. My mom surprised me by getting not only a tub of popcorn for us to share, but she let me pick out any candy I wanted from the candy rack, which was considered to be a delicacy by my 8-year-old self. I chose the pack of Twizzlers. The movie was, as I had expected, amazing. While we were walking out of the theater, we passed by the ticket booth, and I glanced over to see if the man that sold us our tickets was still there. And he was. He was standing perfectly upright, with his arms stiffened and at his sides. He was still looking at me through the glare of the glass, and I felt uncomfortable. To this day, I don't know why I did what I did next. I can't remember what my younger self was thinking, but I waved at him. Maybe it was to break the awkwardness of the situation, or maybe I wasn't thinking anything at all. It's not even necessarily that I waved at him, but that he waved back. He lifted his right hand and waved slowly, like how a princess waves. I know that might sound ridiculous, but in hindsight, it was very unsettling. "You all right, kiddo?" my mom said. I was nearly tripping over myself while my attention was drawn toward the stranger behind the booth, and she had noticed. I snapped out of whatever had me. "Huh? Oh yeah, I'm fine," I said, not very convincingly. Her parenting sixth sense must have been going haywire because she also looked behind her. After a moment, she turned back around, and we both started walking a little faster out of there. I think my mom was looking for a way to cheer herself up from that creep looking at us, so she surprised me again when she took me to the Toys R Us that shared the parking lot of the mall. I was basically clamoring to get to the train aisle, and once there, my mom let me pick out any train I wanted. After combing through the aisle with the precision of a prison cavity search, I narrowed it down to 2. I was torn between the new character from the movie, Lady, and a Thomas train that was completely gold. I decided that the Golden Thomas was better than Lady, and I almost left skipping out of the store with my mom. The next day, I got up particularly early, especially for it being summer. I found my mom making coffee in the kitchen, and for some reason, that morning I really wanted to play in the dirt lot in our backyard. I asked her if she could call my aunt and schedule a play date with Isaiah so we could play in the dirt. We lived in a new neighborhood, one of the many pop-up homes that had rapidly sprung up because of the rise in people moving to our town. The construction business was booming. There was a long stretch of dirt behind the line of homes on our block. It was going to be a green belt of grass that served as a divider between our neighborhood and the next, but it was unfinished. If you followed the green belt to the west, you would eventually end up near the mall. If you followed it east, you would reach a small forest reserve, officially named the Amon Basin Preserve, but we called it something else. Isaiah, some of the other kids on our block, and I would often play in the dirt, digging holes, playing with our construction toys, and in our case, bringing out our Legos so we could play on what we called realistic terrain. The best part was, we thought it was so cool. That's exactly what we did that day. We each brought out our own Star Wars Legos and found a patch of terrain that looked particularly epic for our Lego battle. It was clones versus droids, and I was on the clone side. I was digging out a part of the earth that I thought would make a suitable cave for cover when my hand touched something hard in the dirt. This wasn't out of the ordinary. It was basically an active construction site. I grabbed hold of whatever it was and pulled it out. "Whoa, what the heck is that, dude?" Isaiah shouted, shocked by what I held in my hand. I was just as astounded at what I had found. The best I could figure at the time was that it was a weird piece of art that someone had lost. But whatever it was certainly made of bone. It seemed like small animal bones. There were 3, what looked like chicken thigh bones formed into a triangle with twine holding each point together. 2 twigs, also tied to the bones, were laid across each other, forming an X over the triangle with a coin attached to the center of the X. Some other twigs and leaves were tied to the artifact, but what intrigued me the most was the coin. My gaze seemed to be halted, not by the coin itself, but by what was inscribed on it. There was a curious symbol on it that I had never seen before, and I was transfixed by it. Since then, I've had nightmares revolving around that sigil. "What is that thing?" Isaiah said right behind me, breaking me from the grasp of my own intrigue. He went to grab it. "Well, what is it?" "Let me see," he said. "Too slow," I said as I yanked it away just as he was about to grasp it. "Hey, no fair, let me see," he protested. "Yes, fair," I said smugly. "It's in my backyard, so it's mine, and you can't see it." At that moment, I was decidedly being a little shit. I stuffed the totem in my back pocket and insisted we forget about it and keep playing. But I didn't forget about it at all. It was in the back of my mind the whole time. I wondered who made it, where it came from, and what it meant, all the way up until I landed my head on my pillow that night. Thoughtlessly, I hid it under my bed so Jessie wouldn't see it and ask me any questions. I don't know why I was so protective of that piece of junk. That night, after going to bed with my new Thomas toy, I was stirred awake by a thudding sound. It was rhythmic, thud, 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 then it would stop. Again, thud, 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 then stop. It repeated like this until I finally woke up. My brother and I shared a room, so assuming it was him, I said his name before my eyes were even fully open. "Jesse," I said in a whispered shout. "What?" he replied. I could tell by his voice that I had just woken him up. "What are you doing? What's that sound?" I heard him readjust in his bed to look at me. "What do you mean? What am I doing? What the hell are you doing?" he said, not whispering anymore. "What?" I said. I opened my eyes and realized I wasn't lying in my bed as I had thought. I was actually standing upright in front of our closed bedroom door, with my head resting against it. I stood there confused. "Chris," my brother said, "what are you doing?" I didn't have an answer because I didn't know. I don't know," I said. "Stop being weird and go back to bed," Jesse said as he rolled over. I got back into bed, but I lay awake for a long time. I began to sleepwalk almost every night from then on. My brother would catch me standing at the door and softly thudding my head against it. After the third night, Jesse told our parents. I honestly think he was scared, and I don't blame him. My dad didn't think much of it because, in the beginning, it wasn't so concerning. But I remember my mom seeming worried, and to be honest, that unsettled me. My nighttime activity only became stranger when I began to speak while I sleepwalked. At first I was only mumbling, saying unintelligible things. But one night, about a week after I began to sleepwalk, my mom woke up to what she thought was soft knocking on the front door. Usually, my mom would have my father check on things like nighttime visitors, but he was working an overnight shift that night. So, she got out of bed, put her robe on, and went to check for herself. What she saw shocked and somewhat horrified her. I was standing at the front door, my hand on the knob and softly hitting my head against the door in the same rhythmic fashion as before. But this time, after each repetition of 3 thuds, I would say quietly, "I have to go now." She walked over to me cautiously and caught her breath when she saw my face. My eyes were open wide and wild, with my pupils extremely dilated, leaving only a thin ring of blue around them. She took me by the hand, waking me up and breaking me out of the trance I was seemingly in. I was very confused and clueless, but my mom later admitted to me when I was older that this experience truly disturbed her. This specific behavior repeated multiple times, with either my mom, Dad, or Jesse finding me by the door. One of the times Jesse found me, he actually decided to engage with me verbally and ask where I had to go. His account is chilling, to say the least. He woke up at around 3 in the morning to the now familiar sound of thudding on the front door. He left our room and found me standing, facing the door in the dark. Thud, thud, thud. "I have to go now," I said. By this point, Jesse was used to just waking me up and leading me back to bed. "Chris," he said, trying to wake me up, but it didn't work. Thud, thud, thud. "I have to go now," I repeated. "Chris," he said louder. According to Jesse, I then slowly turned to look at him, my eyes dilated and watering as though I'd been crying. "I have to go now, Jesse," I said in a dreamy voice. "Where do you have to go?" he asked apprehensively. I have to go to Neverland, Jesse. Off to Neverland. Sufficiently freaked out by that point, Jesse shook me awake. Jesse said later that I must have been having a nightmare because I inhaled dramatically. When I saw that it was Jesse standing next to me, I began to really cry, adding to the idea that I was indeed having a nightmare. Although I can't remember what it was, I collapsed into my brother's arms and he hugged me tightly. I was beginning to scare myself. The next day, my parents scheduled an appointment with a sleep specialist, hoping to receive answers about my unconscious behavior that was growing more concerning nearly every night.